I am NightSleepWhisper, and tonight, I will tell you a secret. The story of an empty carriage, a missing man, and a grand truth hidden deep within an ancient city. As we solve this mystery with Mr. Blackwood and Elena, you will feel yourself getting heavier and more at peace with every chapter. If you are ready, let's travel to that first cold night of 1885. The fog was very thick on that Tuesday afternoon in London. It was the year 1885, and the city felt cold and damp. The yellow mist covered the streets and the tall brick buildings. It was difficult to see the horses and the people walking below. Inside a small building on a quiet street, Mr. Edward Blackwood sat in his private office. Mr. Blackwood was a private investigator. He was 45 years old. He had a tall, thin frame and very sharp blue eyes. His hair was starting to turn grey at the sides, which gave him a very serious look. He wore a dark wool suit that was perfectly clean. He was a man who noticed every small detail, from a speck of dust on a coat to a nervous look in a person's eye. His office was small but very neat. There was a large mahogany desk in the center of the room. On the desk, there were several stacks of paper, a glass inkwell, and a silver pocket watch. A small gas lamp provided a warm, flickering light. The walls were covered with tall shelves full of heavy books about law and science. The room smelled of old paper and black tea. It was a very quiet day. Mr. Blackwood sat in his leather chair and watched the clock on the wall. He liked his work, but he did not like being bored. He had spent the entire morning reading the local newspapers. There were no interesting crimes to solve. He sighed and looked at the window. The fog pressed against the glass like a heavy blanket. In Victorian London, the fog often hid many dark secrets. Then, he heard a sound. It was the sound of heavy leather shoes on the wooden stairs outside. The footsteps were slow and careful. They stopped right in front of his door. Mr. Blackwood stood up slowly. He adjusted his tie and waited. A moment later, there was a firm, rhythmic sound of a hand hitting the wood of the door. It was not a loud sound, but it was very confident. "Come in." Mr. Blackwood called out. His voice was steady and polite. The door opened slowly. A woman stepped into the office. She was tall and dressed in a very expensive black silk dress. She wore a wide hat with a black veil that covered her face. In her hands, she carried a small bag made of fine leather. She moved with grace, but her hands were shaking slightly. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was low and filled with worry. "Yes, I am Edward Blackwood," he replied. He walked around his desk to greet her. "Please, madam, come and sit down. You look very troubled." The woman walked to the chair and sat down. She reached up and moved the veil away from her face. She was a beautiful woman with dark hair, but her skin was very pale. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying for a long time. She looked at Mr. Blackwood with hope. "My name is Mrs. Gable," she began. "I do not know who else to talk to. My husband, Mr. Gable, is a very important man at the Citibank. He is a man of habit. He is never late. But last night, something impossible happened." Mr. Blackwood sat back in his chair and picked up his pen. "I am listening. Mrs. Gable, please, tell me your story." "Last night," she said, her voice trembling. "His carriage arrived at our front door at exactly 10 o'clock. The horse was there. The driver was there. But when the servant opened the carriage door, the seat was empty. My husband was gone." Mrs. Gable took a small, white handkerchief from her bag. She pressed it to her eyes. Mr. Blackwood waited patiently. He knew that in a mystery, silence often helped people remember important things. The gas lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. "Tell me about the journey," Mr. Blackwood said softly. "Where did it begin?" My husband, Arthur, left the bank at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Gable explained. He always leaves at that time. He is a very organized man. Our driver, a young man named John, was waiting for him outside the bank doors. John said he saw my husband step into the carriage. He heard the door close and then he started the horse. Mr. Blackwood leaned forward. Did John see his face? He said it was very dark and the fog was thick. She replied. But the man wore Arthur's long grey coat and his favourite tall hat. John drove the carriage through the city streets. He did not stop. He did not see anyone enter or leave the carriage during the trip. It takes 30 minutes to reach our house. And when they arrived, Mr. Blackwood asked, John stopped the carriage in front of our stairs. Mrs. Gable said, our servant, Peter, went outside to open the door. Peter opened the door and smiled, ready to say good evening. But there was no one there. The seat was empty. My husband's hat was on the floor of the carriage, but the man was gone. Mr. Blackwood wrote a few words in his notebook. His handwriting was neat and small. This was a very strange puzzle. How can a man disappear from a moving carriage without the driver noticing? The streets of London were busy, but a man jumping from a carriage would surely make a sound or attract attention. Did John hear anything unusual? He asked. No. Mrs. Gable said. She shook her head sadly. John said the ride was very quiet. He only heard the sound of the horse on the wet stones and the wheels of the carriage. He did not hear the door open. He did not hear a cry for help. Is the carriage still at your house? Blackwood asked. Yes. She answered. I told the servants not to touch it. I remembered reading about your work in the newspaper. I knew you would want to see it exactly as it was. Mr. Blackwood stood up and reached for his heavy wool coat. He also picked up his own hat and a small magnifying glass from his desk. He felt a spark of interest. This was not a simple robbery. This was something much more clever. You did the right thing, Mrs. Gable. He said. We must go to your house immediately. I want to see this carriage before the light disappears. The fog is getting worse, and we do not have much time. They walked out of the office and down the wooden stairs. Outside, the air was cold and smelled of smoke. A black carriage was waiting for them. Mr. Blackwood helped Mrs. Gable inside. He looked at the driver and then at the dark, grey sky. Somewhere in this big, silent city, a man was missing, and the only clue was an empty seat. The carriage carrying Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable stopped in front of a very large house. It was a grand mansion made of grey stone. The windows were tall, and the iron gates were painted black. Because of the thick fog, the house looked like a dark ghost in the night. 2 gas lamps burned near the front door, but they only gave a little light. Wait here, John, Mrs. Gable said to the driver. Mr. Blackwood stepped out of the carriage. He felt the cold air on his face. He walked toward another carriage parked in the shadows of the driveway. This was the carriage from the night before. It looked normal, but to Mr. Blackwood, it was the center of a deep mystery. May I have a lantern? Blackwood asked. A servant quickly brought a small brass lantern. Mr. Blackwood took it. He moved the light across the outside of the carriage. He looked at the wooden doors and the wheels. There were no marks or scratches. The door was closed perfectly. He opened the door slowly. The door moved easily. Mr. Blackwood stepped inside and sat on the soft leather seat. It was dark and quiet inside. He smelled the faint scent of expensive tobacco and the perfume that Mrs. Gable wore. He moved his lantern slowly over the floor. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he noticed something small near the corner of the seat. He reached down and picked up a tiny object. It was a flower. The flower was a deep, dark purple color. It had 5 soft petals and a very sweet, heavy smell. It was not a flower that grew in London during the cold months of autumn. This was a rare, tropical flower. "Mrs. Gable, please look at this," Blackwood said. He stepped out of the carriage and held the flower in his hand. Mrs. Gable walked closer. She looked at the purple petals and frowned. "I have never seen a flower like this before," she said. "It is very beautiful, but it did not come from our garden. My husband does not like flowers. He thinks they are a waste of money. Why was it in the carriage?" "It is very fresh," Blackwood remarked. "It was not here 2 days ago. It fell from someone's coat or dress. Or perhaps, someone left it there on purpose." He put the flower into a small glass bottle and placed it in his pocket. He then looked at the floor of the carriage again. He found a small amount of dried mud. The mud was a light red color. The mud in this part of London is dark brown or black, Blackwood said to himself. This red mud comes from the area near the river docks. Mrs. Gable looked worried. "The docks?" "But Arthur never goes to the docks. He says that area is dangerous and dirty. He only goes from the bank to this house." Mr. Blackwood looked at the dark sky. The mystery was growing. He had a rare flower and red mud. "Tomorrow morning, we must visit the bank," he said. "I want to see your husband's office. If he did not leave the carriage, perhaps he never truly entered it." Mrs. Gable nodded. She looked at the empty carriage and shivered. The cold wind moved through the trees. Mr. Blackwood knew that the answer was waiting somewhere in the fog, and the purple flower was the first piece of the puzzle. The next morning, the sun was a pale white circle in the grey sky. The fog was thinner than the day before, but the air was still very cold. Mr. Blackwood met Mrs. Gable in front of the London City Bank. The bank was a magnificent building with tall stone columns and a large clock above the entrance. Many men in dark suits and top hats walked quickly through the doors. They all looked busy and serious. Inside, the floor was made of polished white marble. The sound of many voices filled the large, echoing room. Mrs. Gable led Mr. Blackwood to a private area at the back of the building. A man with a very small mustache and round glasses came toward them. This was Mr. Henderson, the bank manager. "Mrs. Gable," Mr. Henderson said with a worried look. He bowed his head politely. "Is there any news of your husband? We are very concerned. He is never absent from his work. The bank feels different without him." "No news yet, Mr. Henderson," she replied. "This is Mr. Blackwood. He is helping me find Arthur. We want to see his office immediately." Mr. Henderson looked at the investigator with curiosity. "Of course. Please, follow me. It is at the end of the hall." They walked down a long, quiet hallway with many heavy doors. At the very end was a door made of dark oak wood. It had a small brass plate that said Mr. Arthur Gable. Mr. Henderson reached for the handle and turned it. The door did not move. He tried again, pulling harder, but the door stayed closed. "That is very strange," Mr. Henderson whispered. He looked confused. "I have the master key in my pocket, but the door is locked from the inside. The internal bolt is across." Mr. Blackwood stepped forward. He knelt down on the floor and looked through the small keyhole. He could see the metal end of another key. "The key is still in the lock on the other side," he said. "Someone locked this door from the inside and never opened it again." "But how is that possible?" Mrs. Gable asked. Her voice was thin and high. "If the door is locked from the inside, Arthur must be in there. He must be. Or someone else is," Blackwood added quietly. He looked at the bank manager. "We must open this door now." Mr. Henderson called for a strong worker from the counting room. The worker arrived with a heavy metal tool. He placed the tool against the wood near the lock and pushed with all his strength. There was a sharp, breaking sound as the wood split. The door flew open and hit the inside wall. The office was very quiet. The curtains were pulled shut, so the room was dark and smelled of old dust. Mr. Blackwood walked in first. He looked at the large desk, the leather chairs, and the fireplace. There was no one in the room. The office was completely empty. He walked to the window and pulled the heavy green curtains back. The window was shut and locked with a metal latch. He then walked back to the door and picked up the key that had fallen to the floor. He held it up to the light. A locked room with no one inside. Blackwood said, turning the key over in his hand. The mystery of the empty carriage has now become the mystery of the empty office. Mr. Gable was here. He locked the door, and then he vanished. Mr. Blackwood moved slowly through the office. He did not want to disturb any evidence. The room felt like a place where time had stopped. He walked to the mahogany desk and looked at the items on top of it. There was a stack of bank documents, a pen, and a delicate porcelain cup. He reached out and touched the side of the cup. "The tea is very cold," he said. He looked at the liquid inside. It was dark and there was a thin film on the surface. This tea was made many hours ago. It was likely made yesterday evening, just before he was supposed to leave for the carriage. Next to the cup was a sheet of white paper. Mr. Blackwood picked it up carefully. It was a letter, but it was not finished. The handwriting was elegant, but the letters looked hurried and slanted. The letter began, "My dear brother, I have discovered something very disturbing about the vault. I cannot speak of it here, but we must meet at." The sentence ended there. There was a small blot of dark ink where the pen had stopped suddenly. It looked as if Mr. Gable had been interrupted while he was writing. He did not have time to finish his thought or even sign his name. "Does your husband often write to his brother?" Blackwood asked, looking at Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable looked confused. She held her hands together tightly. "His brother, Arthur. No, they do not speak very often. Arthur is a man of business, but they had a big disagreement many years ago. They have not shared a meal in a long time. Why would he write to him now?" Blackwood did not answer yet. He looked at the fireplace. There were some burnt pieces of paper in the grey ash. He knelt down and used a small metal tool to move the ash. He found a tiny corner of paper that was not completely burnt. On it, he could see a small stain of the same purple color as the flower from the carriage. "It seems your husband was keeping secrets, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood said. He stood up and brushed the dust from his trousers. He was writing to a brother he does not like, and he had a rare flower in his office. This was not a normal day for him. He then walked to the large window. He pulled the heavy green curtains even wider to let in more of the pale morning light. The glass was thick and old. He looked down at the street below. The fog was still there, but he could see the shapes of people moving on the pavement. Suddenly, Blackwood stopped moving. He saw a man standing perfectly still on the opposite side of the road. The man wore a long black coat and a tall top hat. He was not walking like the other people. He was looking directly up at the bank office window. "Mrs. Gable," Blackwood said quietly, "do not move quickly. Come here and look across the street. Do you know that man?" Mrs. Gable walked to the window and looked out. She turned very pale and stepped back. "I do not know his face," she whispered. "But he has been there since we arrived at the bank. He looks like a dark shadow." Blackwood watched the man. The stranger did not move. He stood like a statue in the cold London air. It was clear that they were being watched. The mystery was no longer just about a missing man. It was now a dangerous game. Mr. Blackwood stood very still by the office window. He did not want the stranger to know he was being watched. The man across the road was not on the pavement anymore. He was now standing behind the glass of a second-floor window in the building opposite the bank. The building was old and looked like a place for small businesses and lawyers. "He is moving," Blackwood whispered to Mrs. Gable. "He is hiding behind the curtain now. He is very careful, but I saw the shine of his eyes." Mrs. Gable gripped her bag tightly. Her face was full of fear. "Why is he watching us? Do you think he knows where Arthur is? Perhaps he is the one who took him." "It is possible," Blackwood replied. He turned to Mr. Henderson, the bank manager. "What is that building across the street? Who lives or works there?" Mr. Henderson cleaned his glasses and looked out. "That is the Miller Building. It has many small offices. Most of them are empty or belong to people who trade in silk and tea. I do not know everyone who goes in and out of those doors." "I must go there," Blackwood said firmly. He began to button his coat. "Mrs. Gable, please stay here with Mr. Henderson. Keep the door locked. Do not open it for anyone except me. Please be careful, Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was a small whisper. Blackwood nodded and walked out of the office. He moved quickly down the long hallway. He did not take the main stairs. Instead, he used the narrow stairs at the back of the bank. He wanted to be a surprise. He reached the street level and opened a small side door. The cold air hit him again. The smell of the city was strong: coal smoke, wet stones, and the salty air from the river. He crossed the street with fast, long steps. He kept his head down so his hat covered his face. He reached the entrance of the Miller Building and stepped inside. The entrance hall was dark and narrow. There was no one at the front desk. The floor was made of old wood that felt soft under his boots. He heard the sound of a heavy door closing somewhere above him. It was a slow, solid sound that echoed through the quiet building. Blackwood moved up the stairs. He was very silent. He reached the second floor and looked at the doors. Most of them were closed and had no names on them. He walked to the door that was exactly opposite Mr. Gable's office. He reached for the handle. It was cold metal. He turned it slowly, but the door was locked. He put his ear against the wood. He heard the sound of fast breathing on the other side. Then, he heard the sound of a window being opened. The wood of the window frame rubbed against the stone wall. Blackwood did not wait. He threw his shoulder against the door with a lot of force. The lock broke with a sharp, dry sound. The door swung open and hit the wall. The room was small and dusty. There was a single chair and a small table. A heavy black coat lay on the floor. The window was wide open, and the cold fog was rolling into the room. Blackwood ran to the window and looked down. He saw the man in the top hat. The stranger was already on the ground in the narrow alley below. He was running away fast. He had a silver-headed walking stick in his hand. He turned a corner and disappeared into the grey mist. Blackwood looked at the table in the room. There was nothing on it except for a small, brass telescope. The man had been using it to watch the bank for a long time. Next to the telescope, there was a single, purple petal. It was exactly like the petals of the flower from the carriage. Mr. Blackwood walked back across the street. The fog felt colder now, and the damp air made his coat heavy. He entered the bank and went straight to the private office. Mrs. Gable was sitting in a chair. Her face was very pale. Mr. Henderson stood near the broken door. They both looked at him with big, questioning eyes. "The man escaped," Blackwood said. He took off his hat and placed it on the desk. He was very fast. He was watching this room with a telescope. "I found another purple petal in that room. He is definitely connected to your husband's disappearance." Mrs. Gable let out a long breath. What does it mean? Why would a man watch a bank office? He was waiting for something. Blackwood replied. And I think that something is still inside this room. He turned his attention away from the desk and looked at the walls. The office was filled with many tall bookshelves made of dark wood. The books were old and covered in leather. Most of them were about money, laws, and the history of the city. Blackwood began to move his hands across the spines of the books. He was looking for something that did not belong. He reached the third shelf. He noticed a set of books that looked a little different. They were very clean. They did not have the thin layer of dust that the other books had. He touched the edge of a large, black book. It did not feel like paper and leather. It felt like cold metal. These are not real books. Blackwood whispered. He pulled the set of books toward him. They did not come off the shelf. Instead, the whole section of the shelf moved forward. There was a low, rubbing sound of wood on wood. Behind the fake books, there was a small, square door made of thick iron. It was a hidden safe. I did not know about this, Mrs. Gable said. She stood up and walked toward the wall. Arthur never told me he had a safe here. He usually keeps our important papers at home. It is a very secret place. Mr. Henderson added. He looked surprised. Only the highest bank officers have safes like this. I did not know Mr. Gable had one in his private office. The safe was very strong. It had a heavy metal dial on the front with many numbers. Blackwood looked at the dial. He knew he could not open it with force. He needed the combination or a key. Does your husband have any favorite numbers? Blackwood asked. Perhaps a date or a number that is important to him. Mrs. Gable thought for a moment. He is a man of business. He likes the number of his first bank account. It was 18. 42. 10. He uses it for many things. Blackwood turned the metal dial carefully. He heard the small, internal parts of the safe moving against each other. It was a delicate process. He reached the first number, then the second, and then the third. He tried to pull the handle. The metal was frozen. It did not move. That was a good guess, but it is not the answer, Blackwood said. He looked at the safe again. He saw a small mark near the bottom of the iron door. It looked like a tiny, scratched letter B. He remembered the letter Mr. Gable was writing. My dear brother. What is his brother's name? Blackwood asked. His brother's name is Silas. Mrs. Gable answered. Blackwood looked at the dial again. He tried a different set of numbers. This time, there was a soft, metallic sound from inside the door. He turned the handle. The heavy iron door moved open slowly. Inside the dark safe, there was a single, small brass key and a folded piece of paper. Mr. Blackwood reached into the dark safe with his thin fingers. He felt the cold metal of the brass key and the dry texture of the folded paper. He pulled them out and placed them on the mahogany desk. The gas light from the lamp made the brass key shine. It was a small, heavy key with a round top. It looked like the kind of key used for a private locker or a small chest. Does this key look familiar to you, Mrs. Gable? Blackwood asked. The woman looked at the key closely. She touched the cold metal, then shook her head. No, she said. I have never seen this key in our house. Arthur keeps his keys on a silver ring, but this one is not part of his set. Next, Mr. Blackwood unfolded the yellow paper. It was a large, hand-drawn map. It did not show the parks, the houses, or the shops of London. Instead, it showed a network of lines and circles. It was a map of the London Underground tunnels. In 1885, the Underground Railway was still new and growing. Many parts of it were dark and not yet open to the public. The Underground? Mr. Henderson asked. He adjusted his glasses to see better. Mr. Gable is a man of the surface. He likes his carriage and his horses. He always says the tunnels are too smoky and dirty for a gentleman. Why would he have a map of them? Blackwood pointed to a specific part of the map. There was a red circle around a station near the river. Next to the circle, someone had written a series of numbers. 12, 05, 85. That is today's date. Blackwood whispered. And look here. There is a blue line that goes from this station toward the bank building. Are you saying there is a tunnel under the bank? Mrs. Gable asked. She looked at the floor as if she expected it to open up. It is possible. Blackwood replied. Many old buildings in this city have basements that connect to the source or the railway. If your husband wanted to leave the bank without being seen by the people in the main hall, he might have used a secret way. He looked at the key again. Then he looked at the map. He realized that the map and the key were a set. One showed the way, and the other opened the door. Mr. Henderson, Blackwood said, turning to the manager. Is there a basement in this bank that leads to the lower levels of the city? Mr. Henderson looked nervous. He rubbed his hands together. There is an old storage room in the lowest level. We use it for old furniture and broken desks. But the door is very old and the air is bad down there. No one goes there anymore. We must go there now. Blackwood said. He picked up the key and the map. Mrs. Gable stood up. I am coming with you. I want to find my husband. It may be dark and dirty. Mrs. Gable. Blackwood warned. I do not care about my dress, she said firmly. Her eyes showed a new strength. I only care about Arthur. Blackwood nodded. He liked her courage. He took the brass lantern from the desk and checked the oil. The light was steady. He led the way out of the office and toward the back of the bank, where the stairs went deep into the ground. The mystery was moving away from the bright offices and into the dark, silent world beneath the streets of London. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Gable, and Mr. Henderson walked down the narrow stone stairs. Each step took them deeper into the ground. The air became heavy and cold. The bright, clean halls of the bank were now far above them. Here, the walls were made of rough, grey stone, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of grey dust. It is very dark down here, Mrs. Gable whispered. She held onto the sleeve of Mr. Blackwood's coat. The lantern is strong, Blackwood said. He held the brass lantern high. The yellow light moved across the room. It showed many old, broken things. There were wooden chairs with 3 legs, heavy desks covered in spiderwebs, and stacks of old paper that were turning yellow. They reached the end of the large storage room. Mr. Blackwood stopped. He looked at the map in his hand and then at the wall. The map showed a door in this exact corner, but all they could see was a very large, heavy wooden cabinet. The cabinet was filled with old bank records from 50 years ago. This cabinet is in the way, Mr. Henderson said. It is too heavy to move. It has been here for a very long time. Blackwood knelt down. He looked at the floor near the base of the cabinet. He saw something interesting. There were deep scratches in the stone floor. The scratches were fresh. They were not covered in dust. Someone moved this recently, Blackwood said. He put his lantern on the floor. Mr. Henderson, please help me. We must push this cabinet to the left. The 2 men placed their hands against the dark wood. They pushed with all their strength. The cabinet made a long, loud scraping sound against the stone floor. It moved slowly, inch by inch. As the cabinet moved, a small wooden door appeared behind it. The door was very simple and had no handle, only a small, round keyhole. Mr. Blackwood took the brass key from his pocket. He placed it into the keyhole and turned it. There was a sharp, metallic click as the lock opened. He pushed the door. It opened into a dark, narrow tunnel. The tunnel was small. A tall man would have to bend his head to walk through it. The walls were wet, and water dripped slowly from the ceiling. Blackwood stepped inside and moved his light around. He saw a set of footprints in the soft mud on the floor. These footprints belonged to two different people. Blackwood observed. One pair of shoes is very expensive and narrow, likely your husband's. The other pair is larger and has heavy, flat soles. Those are the shoes of a working man. John the driver. Mrs. Gable exclaimed. He wears heavy boots like that. We must find him. Blackwood said. This tunnel goes a long way. If I am correct, it leads toward the river docks. There is a pub near the end of this path called the Rusty Anchor. Many sailors and drivers go there. They did not follow the tunnel yet. Blackwood knew it was dangerous to go into the dark without a plan. He closed the secret door and locked it. We will go to the surface and travel to the docks by carriage. Blackwood decided. We need to find John before he leaves the city. He is the only person who knows how the carriage became empty. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable left the cold basement of the bank. They walked back up the stone stairs and through the main hall. The bank was still busy, but the air felt different to them now. They carried a heavy secret. Outside, the London fog was as thick as a grey wall. It was difficult to see the other side of the street. We must find my carriage, Mrs. Gable said. She pulled her black cloak tightly around her shoulders. The damp air made her shiver. They walked toward the spot where their carriage was waiting. As they reached the edge of the pavement, Mr. Blackwood suddenly stopped. He knelt down near a heavy iron lamp post. The ground was wet and covered in a thin layer of mud and oil from the street. What is it? Mrs. Gable asked. She looked down at the dark ground. Mr. Blackwood reached into the gutter. His fingers moved through the wet dirt. He picked up a small, round object. He used his white handkerchief to wipe the mud away. Under the dirt, something began to shine. It was a silver coin, but it was not a British shilling or a crown. He held the coin up to the light of the gas lamp. The coin was bright and heavy. On one side, there was the face of a man with a laurel wreath on his head. On the other side, there were words written in a language that was not English. Is that a fake coin? Mrs. Gable asked, leaning closer. No. Blackwood replied. His voice was very serious. It is a real coin, but it does not belong to England. This is a French silver franc. It is very clean and new. It has not been in the mud for very long. Why would a French coin be here, outside the bank? She asked. Perhaps it fell from the pocket of the man in the top hat. Blackwood suggested. Or perhaps our driver, John, was paid with foreign money. People who want to hide their tracks often use money from other countries. It is harder for the police to follow. He placed the silver coin into his pocket next to the purple flower. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. He had a rare flower, red mud from the docks, a map of secret tunnels, and now a French coin. The mystery of the missing banker was growing larger. It was no longer just a local problem. We are going to the docks now, Blackwood told the driver as they climbed into the carriage. Take us to the area near the Rusty Anchor. We need to move fast. The carriage started to move. The wheels made a steady, rhythmic sound on the wet cobblestones. As they drove away from the bank, Blackwood looked out the window. He looked for the man in the black coat, but the fog hid everything. The docks are a dangerous place for a lady, Blackwood warned Mrs. Gable. There are many rough men and dark corners. You must stay close to me at all times. I am not afraid, Mr. Blackwood, she said. Her voice did not shake. I want my husband back. If he is at the river, then that is where I will go." Mr. Blackwood nodded. He respected her spirit. They sat in silence as the carriage moved through the narrow, winding streets. The smell of the city changed. The smell of coal smoke became mixed with the smell of salt water and old wood. They were getting closer to the River Thames, and closer to the truth. The carriage stopped near the edge of the River Thames. The air here was different from the center of the city. It was very cold and smelled of salt, old wood, and wet fish. The fog was even thicker here. It felt like a heavy, wet blanket over everything. The gas lamps were far apart, and their light was weak and yellow. "We are here, sir," the driver said. He looked nervous. He did not like this part of London. "The Rusty Anchor is just down that narrow street. I cannot take the carriage any further. The road is too small." Mr. Blackwood stepped out first. He gave the driver a silver coin. "Wait for us near the main road," he instructed. "If we are not back in 1 hour, find a police officer." Mrs. Gable stepped out next. She looked at the dark, narrow street. The buildings were old and leaned toward each other. There were no people in sight, but they could hear the distant sound of the river water hitting the wooden piers. The water made a slow, rhythmic splashing sound. "Keep your voice low," Blackwood whispered. "The people who live here do not like strangers." They began to walk toward the pub. The ground was made of uneven stones. It was very slippery because of the mist. Blackwood held his lantern low to see the path. He looked for the red mud he had seen in the carriage. He saw a small patch of it near a stack of wooden crates. Suddenly, Blackwood stopped. He stood perfectly still and tilted his head. "What is it?" Mrs. Gable asked in a tiny voice. "Listen," Blackwood replied. At first, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, they heard it. It was the sound of footsteps behind them. The footsteps were slow and heavy. Every time Blackwood and Mrs. Gable stopped, the footsteps stopped too. When they started walking again, the footsteps followed. "Someone is behind us," Mrs. Gable whispered. Her hand was shaking on Blackwood's arm. "Do not look back," Blackwood said quietly. "Walk a little faster." They moved quickly past a row of dark warehouses. The windows were broken and looked like empty eyes. The footsteps behind them became faster too. The sound of boots on the hard stones was clear and steady. The person behind them was not trying to hide anymore. Blackwood saw a small alleyway between two buildings. "In here," he said. He pulled Mrs. Gable into the darkness of the alley and turned off his lantern. They stood in total darkness. The only thing they could hear was the sound of their own breathing and the heavy thumping of their hearts. The footsteps came closer. They heard the sound of a heavy coat rubbing against a wall. Then, a tall shadow passed by the entrance of the alley. The shadow stopped for a moment, looking into the fog, and then continued down the street toward the pub. "Is he gone?" Mrs. Gable breathed. "For now," Blackwood said. He turned the lantern back on. "But only a little. But he is looking for us. We must reach the pub quickly. The man in the shadow is likely the same man who watched us from the window." Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable arrived at the end of the narrow street. In front of them stood an old building made of dark wood and stone. A wooden sign hung over the door. It showed a heavy, orange-colored anchor covered in rust. The sign moved slowly in the wind, making a high, dry sound like a branch breaking. This was the Rusty Anchor. "Stay behind me," Blackwood said softly. He checked his coat pocket to make sure his notebook and the silver coin were there. He pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the air was very thick and warm. It smelled strongly of old tobacco, fried fish, and cheap ale. The room was lit by a few small oil lamps that hung from the ceiling. The light was dim and orange. Many men sat at long wooden tables. They were mostly sailors and workers from the docks. They wore heavy coats, dirty caps, and had skin that was red from the sea salt and the cold. As soon as the door opened, the room became very quiet. The loud talking stopped. The men turned their heads to look at the newcomers. It was not often that a gentleman in a clean suit and a lady in a silk dress walked into the Rusty Anchor. The silence was heavy and uncomfortable. Blackwood did not look afraid. He walked straight to the long wooden counter at the back of the room. A large man with a very big beard stood there. He was cleaning a glass with a grey cloth. This was the landlord of the pub. "Good evening," Blackwood said. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm looking for a man named John. He is a carriage driver. He usually comes here on Tuesday nights." The landlord stopped cleaning the glass. He looked at Blackwood, then at Mrs. Gable. He did not smile. "Many men named John come here," he said with a deep, rough voice. "It is a common name. Why do you want to find him?" "He has something that belongs to this lady," Blackwood replied. He took the silver franc coin from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "I also want to know who gave him this." The landlord looked at the silver coin. His eyes widened a little bit. He reached out to touch it, but Blackwood put his hand over the coin. "I only want information," Blackwood said. A man sitting at a table near the fireplace stood up. He was a short man with a wooden leg. He walked slowly toward them. "I know John," the man said. "He was here an hour ago." He looked very nervous. He was drinking his ale fast and looking at the door every 2 minutes. Mrs. Gable stepped forward. "Where did he go?" "It is very important." The man with the wooden leg pointed toward the back door of the pub. "He went out that way. He said he had to meet a man about a long journey. He mentioned a ship called the Blue Star." Blackwood thanked the man and looked at the landlord. "Where is the Blue Star parked?" "Pier 14, the landlord answered. "But you should not go there. That ship is leaving for France at midnight. The men on that ship are not friendly to investigators." Blackwood did not wait. He took Mrs. Gable's hand and led her toward the back door. They stepped out into the cold night again. The fog was still there, but now they had a name and a place. The mystery of the empty carriage was moving toward the dark water of the river. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable walked away from the warm light of the pub. The air near the river was very wet. The fog was so thick that the ground and the sky looked like the same grey wall. They walked along the edge of the water. The River Thames was dark and moved slowly. Mr. Blackwood kept his lantern very low. He did not want any sailors to see them. "Is Pier 14 much further?" Mrs. Gable asked. She was walking quickly to stay warm. Her long dress was now wet at the bottom from the damp stones. "It should be just past that large warehouse," Blackwood replied. He pointed to a giant building made of black wood. They reached the end of the warehouse. A long wooden pier moved out into the dark water. At the end of the pier, a large ship sat quietly. It had 2 tall masts that reached up into the fog. On the side of the ship, there were white letters that said the Blue Star. A few lanterns hung from the ship, casting orange circles on the moving water. Blackwood pulled Mrs. Gable behind a stack of heavy ropes. "Look there," he whispered. At the entrance to the pier, 2 men were talking. One man was short and wore a dirty brown coat and a flat cap. It was John, the carriage driver. He looked very frightened. He was looking around at the shadows constantly. The other man was tall. He wore a very long, dark coat and a top hat. It was the same man who had watched them from the window. "That is him," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice shaking. "That is the man from the bank." The man in the top hat reached into his coat. He pulled out a small wooden box. It was about the size of a book. He handed it to John. John took the box with shaking hands. He looked at it as if it were a dangerous snake. "You must take this onto the ship," the tall man said. His voice was deep and cold. It carried easily over the quiet water. "Give it to the captain. Do not open it. If you open it, you will never see the morning sun." John nodded quickly. "And what about Mr. Gable? You said he would be safe if I did this." The tall man smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Mr. Gable is resting. Once the ship leaves for France, he will be free to go. Now, move. The tide is rising." John turned and began to run toward the Blue Star. He held the wooden box tightly against his chest. The tall man watched him for a moment. Then, he turned around and walked back toward the dark streets of the city. He passed very close to where Blackwood and Mrs. Gable were hiding. They held their breath and stayed perfectly still. Once the man was gone, Blackwood stood up. "We have a choice," he said. "We can follow the man in the top hat, or we can go onto that ship. If your husband is on that ship, we must find him before it sails. We must go to the ship." Mrs. Gable said firmly, "I will not leave without Arthur." Blackwood looked at the ship. The sailors were starting to pull up the heavy iron anchor. The wooden boards of the pier made a low groaning sound as the ship began to move slightly. They did not have much time. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable moved quickly away from the pier. Behind them, the man in the grey coat was walking toward their hiding place. He held a long, metal object in his hand. Blackwood could see the stranger's eyes searching the shadows. The fog made the man look like a tall, dark ghost. "Quickly, this way," Blackwood whispered. He found a small side door on the giant warehouse. The door was made of heavy iron and wood. He pushed it, and it opened with a slow, dry groan. They stepped inside and closed it just as the man in the grey coat reached the corner. Blackwood moved a heavy wooden beam across the door to lock it. The inside of the warehouse was freezing. It was a massive room filled with hundreds of wooden crates. The crates were stacked very high, reaching toward the dark ceiling. The air smelled of old paper, dry dust, and wet wool. There was very little light, only the pale grey glow of the moon coming through the small, dirty windows high above. "We cannot stay near the door," Blackwood said. He led Mrs. Gable deeper into the maze of boxes. They heard a heavy thud against the iron door. The men outside were trying to get in. A voice shouted, "I saw them go inside. Find the other entrance." Blackwood looked for another way out. He did not want to be caught in a corner. As they walked through the narrow paths between the crates, he noticed something strange. One of the large boxes was open. Inside, there was not tea, silk, or spices. It was filled with complicated metal parts, gears, springs, and small brass wheels. "This is very unusual," Blackwood said. He picked up a small gear. "These parts are very expensive. They are used for making high-quality clocks or bank safes." Mrs. Gable looked at the crate and frowned. Arthur's bank recently bought new safes. He was very worried about the design. He told me they were the strongest safes in England. He said they were almost impossible to open without the secret keys. Blackwood realized the truth. The man in the top hat is not just a kidnapper. He is a thief. He is using your husband's knowledge to understand those safes. These parts are the tools for a very big crime. Suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps on the roof. Someone was walking above them. Small pieces of white dust fell from the ceiling like snow. The men were not just at the door. They were surrounding the building. "We must hide," Blackwood said. He saw a small space between two large stacks of boxes. They climbed into the gap and stayed very still. The main door of the warehouse opened. A long, yellow light from a lantern moved across the floor. It moved over the crates, coming closer and closer to their hiding spot. Blackwood held his breath. He could hear the heavy breathing of the man with the lantern. "They are in here somewhere," a voice said. It was the cold, deep voice of the man in the top hat. "Find them. We cannot let them leave the docks." The footsteps came closer. A long shadow appeared on the wall next to them. The yellow light of the lantern moved across the dusty floor. It was only a few inches away from Mr. Blackwood's boots. He and Mrs. Gable stayed perfectly still. They did not even breathe. The man in the top hat walked past their hiding spot, his heavy shoes making a slow, rhythmic noise on the wood. He did not look into the small gap between the crates. "He is moving toward the back of the room," Blackwood whispered after a long minute. As he spoke, his eyes caught something on a low shelf nearby. It was a small wooden box. It was the same box the man in the top hat had given to the driver, John, at the pier. John must have hidden it here or dropped it when the chase began. Blackwood reached out his arm and pulled the box into the shadows. The box was made of dark oak and had a simple metal latch. Blackwood opened it very slowly. He was careful not to make any noise. Inside the box, there were two items. The first was a large, heavy iron key. It was much bigger than the brass key they found in the safe. The second item was a piece of thick, grey paper. Blackwood unfolded the paper. It was not a map of the city or the Underground Railway. This map showed the London sewers, the dark, wet tunnels that carried water under the streets. The map was very detailed. It showed the exact path from the River Thames to the stone foundation of the London City Bank. "Look here," Blackwood said, pointing to a red X on the map. "This is a secret entrance. It leads from the main sewer pipe directly into the bank's lowest vault. This is how they plan to steal the gold." Mrs. Gable looked at the map with horror. "The sewers. That is a terrible place. It is dark, dirty, and full of bad air. Nobody goes down there." "That is exactly why the thieves chose it," Blackwood replied. "No one would think to look for them under the ground in the middle of the night. With this key and this map, they can enter the bank and leave without anyone seeing them on the street." Suddenly, they heard a shout from the other side of the warehouse. "I found a hat." They were here. The men were getting closer. They had found the trail. Blackwood looked up. High above them, there was a small ventilation window. It was narrow, but a person could fit through it. He looked at the crates. They were stacked like stairs. "We must go up," Blackwood said. He put the key and the map into his coat. "Follow me, Mrs. Gable. Do not look down." They began to climb the wooden crates. The wood was old and felt slippery, but they moved quickly. Mrs. Gable was brave. She did not complain about her dress or the height. They reached the top of the stack. Blackwood pushed the small window open. The cold night air rushed into the warm warehouse. He helped Mrs. Gable through the window first, then he climbed out after her. They were now on a low roof, looking down at the foggy docks. Below them, they could hear the angry voices of the men inside the warehouse. They had escaped the trap, but the mystery was far from over. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable climbed down from the low roof. They used a narrow iron ladder on the side of the warehouse. The metal was cold and wet under their hands. When they reached the ground, they moved quickly into the shadows of a nearby building. The fog was still thick, but they could see the yellow light of lanterns moving inside the warehouse they had just left. The men were still searching for them. "We cannot go back to the main road yet," Blackwood said. "The man in the top hat has guards everywhere." He looked at the map again by the light of a small match. Next to the warehouse was an old, tall building. It was the Globe Theatre of the docks. It was not a famous theatre for rich people. It was a place where sailors went to see plays and listen to music. The building looked very old and the paint was peeling off the walls. The map shows a small path from the saw to the basement of this theater, Blackwood whispered. Let us see if the theater is connected to our thieves. They found a small door at the back of the theater. It was not locked. They stepped inside and found themselves in a large, dark room. The air was very different here. It did not smell like the river or the city. It smelled of old wood, heavy curtains, and expensive face powder. This was the area behind the stage. Blackwood moved his lantern around the room. There were many wooden boxes and long rows of clothes hanging on metal racks. There were colorful dresses, soldier uniforms, and many different hats. Look at this, Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Gable said. She pointed to a chair in the corner. On the chair, there was a very long, dark coat. Next to it was a tall top hat and a silver-headed walking stick. Blackwood picked up the coat. It was made of fine wool, but there was a small stain of red mud at the bottom. He looked inside the pocket and found a small piece of paper. It was a list of times for the bank's security guards. This is the costume of the man we saw, Blackwood said. He is not a ghost or a shadow. He is an actor. He uses these clothes to hide his face and look like a different person. When he is not wearing these, he can walk past us on the street and we will not know him. Near the coat, there was a small table with a mirror. On the table, there were several masks. One mask was very special. It was made of thin wax and looked like the face of an older man with a grey beard. My husband's brother. Mrs. Gable cried out. She covered her mouth with her hand. The mask looks exactly like Silas. This is why the letter was written to him. Someone wanted people to think Silas was the criminal. Blackwood looked at the mask and then at the heavy iron key in his pocket. The plan is very clever. They use masks and costumes to blame other people. We must find the person who wears these clothes. He is the one who knows where your husband is hidden. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a door opening at the front of the theater. Footsteps began to walk across the wooden stage. The floorboards made a slow, groaning sound. Someone was coming. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable moved quickly. They could not leave through the back door because the men from the warehouse were likely watching the alley. They had to stay inside the theater. Blackwood looked around the dark room. He saw a row of very large, heavy red curtains. They were made of thick velvet and hung from the high ceiling to the wooden floor. Behind here, Blackwood whispered. He pulled the edge of the curtain back, and they both stepped into the dark space between the fabric and the stone wall. The footsteps on the stage became louder. The wooden boards of the floor made a slow, groaning noise under the weight of the person. Through a small gap in the curtains, Blackwood could see a man walking across the stage. The man was not wearing the top hat or the long coat now. He was in his shirt and trousers. He was a middle-aged man with very short hair and a sharp, thin face. He looked very tired and angry. The man walked to the chair where the costume was. He stopped and looked at the empty seat. He saw that the coat was moved and the mask was lying on the table. He stood perfectly still for a long time. He looked around the room with narrow, suspicious eyes. "I know you are here," the man said. His voice was not cold and deep like the man in the top hat. It was higher and sounded like a normal man. "You cannot hide in a theater. I know every corner of this building." Mrs. Gable gripped Blackwood's arm. Her hands were cold. Blackwood put a finger to his lips. He did not move a muscle. The man reached down and picked up the silver-headed walking stick. He began to walk toward the row of curtains. He used the heavy stick to hit the fabric as he walked. Each hit made a soft, dull sound against the velvet. He was checking every hiding spot. He was getting closer and closer to where Blackwood and Mrs. Gable were standing. "Come out," the man said again. "The dock guards are outside. You have nowhere to go." Blackwood looked at the floor. He saw a small metal ring near his foot. It was a handle for a trapdoor in the stage floor. These doors were used by actors to disappear during a play. He pointed to it. Mrs. Gable saw it and nodded. Very slowly and very quietly, Blackwood reached down. He took the metal ring in his hand. He waited for the man to hit the curtain one more time. When the man hit the fabric a few feet away, the sound covered the noise of the trapdoor opening. Blackwood pulled the door up. Below them was a small, dark hole with a wooden ladder. He helped Mrs. Gable into the hole first. She moved silently like a shadow. Then Blackwood stepped inside and pulled the trapdoor shut above his head. Just as the door closed, he heard the man hit the curtain exactly where they had been standing a second before. They were now in a very small, cramped space under the stage. It was full of dust and smelled of old wood. It was almost impossible to see anything. Blackwood did not turn on his lantern yet. He listened to the man above them. He heard the man walking back and forth, hitting the curtains and moving chairs. After a few minutes, the man let out a loud shout of frustration and walked away. A door opened and closed with a heavy sound, and then everything was silent. The theatre was silent again. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable waited under the stage for a long time. They did not move. They did not speak. They listened to the air. After many minutes, they were sure the man in the shirt and trousers was gone. Mr. Blackwood reached into his pocket and took out a small match. He struck it against the stone wall. A tiny, yellow flame appeared. He used the flame to light his brass lantern. The light was small at first, but soon it filled the tiny space under the stage. The area was very low. They had to stay on their knees. The floor was made of dirt and old wood. Dust was everywhere. As Blackwood moved the lantern, he saw that this was not just a small hole for actors. It was the entrance to something much larger. At the back of the space, there was a heavy wooden door in the stone foundation of the building. "Look, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood whispered. "The map showed a path here. This door must lead to the basement." They crawled toward the door. Blackwood pushed it. The door was heavy, but it was not locked. It opened into a large, cold room. They stepped inside and stood up. It felt good to stand straight again. The basement was huge. It was filled with old things from the theatre. There were wooden trees from old plays, fake stone walls made of paper, and many pieces of broken furniture. There were tall chairs with gold paint and long tables with missing legs. Everything was covered in thick, grey dust. Blackwood walked slowly through the room. His boots made soft patterns in the dust. He moved his light over the furniture. Suddenly, he stopped. In the middle of the room, there was a small area that was clean. There was a single wooden chair and a small table. On the table, there was a plate with some bread and a glass of water. "Someone was sitting here very recently," Blackwood observed. Mrs. Gable walked to the table. She picked up a small piece of white fabric that was lying on the floor. It was a man's silk handkerchief. She looked at the corner of the fabric. There were 2 letters sewn into the silk. A.G. "This belongs to Arthur," she cried. Her eyes filled with tears of hope. "He was here. He sat in this chair. He is alive, Mr. Blackwood. I know it." Blackwood looked at the ground near the chair. He saw the same red mud from the docks. He also saw a heavy iron chain attached to the leg of the table. The chain was open now. "They kept him here," Blackwood said. "But he is not here now. They moved him when they realized we were getting close. They are taking him to the bank, or perhaps back to the ship." He looked at the map of the saws again. The path from this basement goes directly to the main saw pipe. If we follow it, we can reach the bank before the thieves finish their work. We must be fast. They have a head start. Mrs. Gable wiped her eyes and stood tall. "Lead the way, Mr. Blackwood. I am ready." They found a small iron gate at the back of the basement. Beyond the gate, a dark tunnel moved down into the earth. The air that came from the tunnel was wet and smelled of old rain. This was the way into the secret world beneath London. Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable did not go into the dark tunnel immediately. Mr. Blackwood held his lantern high and looked around the basement one more time. He wanted to be sure they did not miss any more clues. The light moved across the old theatre props and the dusty furniture. In a far corner, behind a stack of broken wooden doors, he saw a large, rectangular shape. It was covered with a piece of old, heavy carpet. "Wait a moment, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood said. He walked toward the corner. He pulled the dusty carpet away. Underneath it was a very large trunk. It was made of dark iron and had thick wooden ribs across the top. The trunk looked very old, but it was also very strong. On the front of the trunk, there was a massive iron lock. The lock was covered in a little bit of oil, which meant someone had used it recently. "What is inside?" Mrs. Gable asked. She walked closer, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you think Arthur's bank papers are in there?" Mr. Blackwood knelt in the dust. He tried to lift the lid of the trunk, but it did not move. It was locked tight. He examined the lock carefully. It was a complicated design, but the keyhole was familiar. He reached into his pocket and took out the small brass key. This was the same key he had found in the hidden safe back at Mr. Gable's office in Chapter 8. "I think I have the answer right here," Blackwood said. He placed the brass key into the lock. He turned it slowly to the right. He felt the internal metal parts moving. There was a sharp, dry click as the lock opened. The sound was small, but in the quiet basement, it felt very loud. Blackwood put the key back in his pocket and gripped the heavy handle of the trunk. "Be careful," Mrs. Gable whispered. She stepped back a little. Blackwood nodded. He used all his strength to pull the lid up. The hinges were heavy and slow. As the lid opened, a smell of old paper and cold metal came out of the trunk. He held the lantern over the opening so they could see inside. The trunk was divided into different sections. In one section, there were several leather bags. Blackwood opened one bag. Inside, there were many small metal tools. They were thin, sharp, and very strong. "These are professional tools for breaking locks," Blackwood explained. "The thieves used these to practice on the bank's new safe design. They were very prepared." In another section of the trunk, they found a stack of blue papers. They were technical drawings. Blackwood unfolded one. It was a map of the bank's internal alarm system. It showed exactly where the wires were hidden in the walls. "They know everything about the bank," Blackwood said, his voice serious. "They have the tools, the maps, and the keys. The only thing they needed was your husband's help to understand the final lock." He looked at the bottom of the trunk. He saw something else. It was a pair of glasses with gold frames. They were broken. Mrs. Gable picked them up with shaking hands. "These are Arthur's glasses," she said. Her voice was full of sadness. "He cannot see well without them. They must have been very rough with him." Blackwood stood up. He looked at the iron gate and the tunnel again. "They have moved him, and they have taken the most important tools with them. We must follow the tunnel now. We know their plan, but we must stop them before they reach the gold." Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Gable stood over the open iron trunk. The light from the lantern reflected off the metal tools and the broken gold glasses. It was a dark and heavy moment. They knew that Arthur had been there, but the basement was now silent and lonely. "We must find if there is anything else," Blackwood said. He moved the lantern to the other side of the basement. In the corner, near the iron gate that led to the tunnel, sat a second box. This box was much smaller than the first one. It was made of fine silver and decorated with small, blue stones. It looked very expensive and very important. It did not look like it belonged in a dirty theatre basement. "Look at this." Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was a small whisper in the large room. This is the box Arthur used for the bank's most private documents. He kept the keys to the main vault in a box exactly like this. Blackwood walked over to the silver box. He saw a small lock on the front. He took the brass key from his pocket once more. He felt a sense of hope. If the documents or the vault keys were inside, they could stop the thieves before they reached the bank. He placed the key into the silver lock. It turned perfectly. There was a soft sound as the lid moved. Blackwood lifted the lid slowly. He expected to see papers, gold, or perhaps another map. But as the lid opened, his face fell. He held the lantern over the box. The silver box was completely empty. There was nothing inside but a small piece of dark purple velvet at the bottom. The velvet had a faint, sweet smell. It was the same smell as the purple flower they found in the carriage and the bank office. "It is empty," Mrs. Gable said. She sat down on a nearby wooden crate. She looked very tired and very sad. "We are too late. Mr. Blackwood. They have the keys. They have the plan. And they have my husband." Blackwood stood up and looked at the dark tunnel beyond the iron gate. "They are not finished yet," he said firmly. "The box is empty because they are using the keys right now. They are in the tunnels, moving toward the bank. The empty box is a sign that the great plan has started." He reached out and took Mrs. Gable's hand to help her stand up. "We cannot stop now. If the box is empty, it means the thieves are carrying the treasure or the keys with them. If we follow the tunnel, we can catch them before they open the vault." The air from the tunnel felt colder now. It was the smell of the deep earth and the old river water. Blackwood checked his lantern. The oil was still good. He adjusted his coat and looked at the iron gate. "This is the last part of the mystery," he said. "The empty carriage led us to an empty office, and the empty office led us to an empty box. But the tunnel will lead us to the truth." They walked toward the iron gate. Blackwood pushed it open. It made a long, groaning sound that echoed into the darkness. They stepped into the tunnel, leaving the dusty theatre basement behind. The adventure was now moving under the very heart of London. The iron gate moved with a heavy, scraping noise against the stone floor. Mr. Blackwood held the lantern forward to light the way into the tunnel. However, before they walked further, something caught his eye. A small piece of white paper was stuck to the bottom of the iron gate. It was dirty and wet, but it did not look very old. "Wait, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood said. He knelt on the damp ground and pulled the paper away from the metal. "I thought we had found everything in the trunk and the boxes, but the thieves left one more clue behind." He brought the paper close to the light of the lantern. It was a small scrap, torn from a larger page. On it, there were only a few words written in dark, thick ink. The handwriting was sharp and angry. It said, "Midnight, Pier 7. Do not be late. Midnight." Mrs. Gable whispered. She looked at her small silver watch. "Mr. Blackwood, it is already 11:30. We only have 30 minutes. And Pier 7 is at the far end of the docks." Blackwood added. He looked at the map of the Soars again. "This tunnel goes toward the bank, but Pier 7 is in the opposite direction. If we go to the bank, we might miss the meeting at the pier. If we go to the pier, we might miss the thieves at the bank." He looked at the small note again. There was a tiny symbol at the bottom of the paper. It was a drawing of a small, black bird. "The raven," Blackwood said quietly. "That is the mark of a famous thief from France. He is known for using costumes and masks to hide his identity. He never works alone. He always has a boat ready for a fast escape." Mrs. Gable looked worried. "Do you think they are taking Arthur to the pier? Maybe the bank was just a trick to keep the police busy." Blackwood thought for a moment. He looked at the dark tunnel and then back at the theater basement. The Raven is very clever. He knows the police will watch the bank. He wants everyone to look at the gold while he escapes by the river with something even more valuable. Perhaps he is not stealing the gold. Perhaps he is stealing something the bank is keeping for the government. We must choose. Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was strong, even though she was tired. The bank or the pier? Blackwood stood up and put the scrap of paper in his pocket. The note says midnight at Pier 7. If your husband is the key to their plan, he will be where the escape boat is. We are going to the pier. But we cannot go through the streets. The man in the top hat, the actor, is likely watching the roads. He pointed to a different path on the saw map. There is a smaller tunnel here. It goes under the theater and leads directly to the river wall near the lower piers. It will be dirty and difficult, but it is the fastest way to reach Pier 7 without being seen. They turned away from the path to the bank and entered the smaller, darker tunnel. The walls were covered in green moss, and the sound of the river water grew louder with every step. They had to move fast. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and the shadows of the docks were waiting for them. The tunnel was very narrow and dark. The walls were made of old, slippery stones covered in green moss. Mr. Blackwood held the lantern in front of him, but the light could not reach very far. The air was thick with the smell of the river, salt, mud, and old wood. A small stream of black water ran along the center of the path. Every time they stepped into the water, it made a soft, splashing sound. Mrs. Gable followed behind Mr. Blackwood. She had to hold her long silk skirt high to keep it away from the dirty floor. She was breathing fast, and her face was red from the effort. How much further, Mr. Blackwood? She asked. Her voice sounded strange as it echoed against the cold stone walls. We are almost under the pier. Blackwood replied without turning around. The map shows that this path ends at a secret exit in the river wall. If we are lucky, we will come out exactly behind the thieves. He stopped for a moment and pulled his silver pocket watch from his coat. He looked at the time. It was 5 minutes before midnight. The golden hands of the watch seemed to move faster than usual. We must hurry. He whispered. The Raven does not like to wait. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound of the city above them disappeared. Now, they could only hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of water hitting the wooden posts of the docks. The tunnel began to slope upward. The floor was no longer made of stone but of thick, red mud. Blackwood recognized this mud. It was the same as the footprints in the carriage and the theater basement. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the tunnel. It was so strong that it almost blew out the flame in the lantern. This meant that the exit was near. They reached a set of heavy iron bars at the end of the tunnel. Beyond the bars, the dark water of the River Thames moved slowly in the fog. Blackwood reached out and touched the bars. They were covered in orange rust. He looked for a lock but found none. Instead, there was a heavy iron bolt. He pushed the bolt with all his strength. It made a loud, grinding noise of metal on metal, but it did not move. He tried again, using his shoulder for extra power. Finally, the bolt slid back, and the iron gate swung open. They stepped out onto a narrow stone ledge just above the water level. The fog was very thick here. It looked like a sea of grey smoke. To their left, a tall wooden ladder led up the side of the stone wall to the surface of Pier 7. Look there, Mrs. Gable whispered, pointing toward the water. A small, black boat was moving slowly through the fog. It did not have sails. It was a steam launch, and it moved quietly with a low, vibrating sound. On the front of the boat, there was a small flag with a drawing of a black bird. The Raven's boat. Blackwood said. He began to climb the cold iron ladder. Stay close to me, Mrs. Gable. The meeting is about to begin. Mr. Blackwood reached the top of the iron ladder. He moved very slowly and kept his head low. He did not want to be seen by anyone on the pier. He looked over the edge of the stone wall. The pier was a long, wooden platform that reached out into the dark river. The wood was wet and black from the rain and the fog. The air was very cold. Mr. Blackwood could see his own breath in the light of the moon. He reached down and helped Mrs. Gable up the last few steps of the ladder. They both crouched behind a large, wooden barrel that smelled of old salt and fish. "Look there," Blackwood whispered. He pointed to the very end of Pier 7. Through the moving fog, they saw a small boat. It was the same black boat they had seen from below. It was tied to a wooden post with a thick rope. The boat moved up and down with the river water. On the back of the boat, a single lantern hung from a metal pole. The light was weak and yellow. It flickered in the cold wind, casting long, jumping shadows on the wooden pier. 2 men stood near the boat. One man was tall and thin. He wore a dark coat and a cap. He was holding the rope and looking at the dark streets of the city. The second man was sitting inside the boat. He was hidden in the shadows, but Blackwood could see the glow of a small pipe he was smoking. The smell of strong tobacco moved through the air. "Where is the Raven?" Mrs. Gable whispered. She was looking at the men, but she did not see the man in the top hat or her husband. "Be patient," Blackwood replied. The note said midnight. "It is almost time." Suddenly, they heard the sound of wheels on the cobblestone street behind them. A small, black carriage was approaching the pier. It did not have any lights. It moved quietly, like a ghost in the fog. The carriage stopped at the entrance to the pier. The carriage door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall and wore the familiar long coat and top hat of the actor they had seen before. He was carrying a small, heavy bag in one hand. In the other hand, he held the silver-headed walking stick. He walked with long, confident steps toward the boat. Behind him, 2 other men stepped out of the carriage. They were holding a third person by the arms. This person was smaller and looked very weak. His head was down, and he was struggling to walk. He wore a grey suit that was now dirty and torn. "Arthur," Mrs. Gable breathed. She tried to stand up, but Mr. Blackwood caught her arm and pulled her back down. "Not yet," he warned. "There are 4 of them and only one of us. We must wait for the right moment." The man in the top hat reached the boat. He spoke to the man with the pipe. His voice was low, but the water carried the sound to Blackwood's ears. "The keys are used. The vault is open. We have the documents. Now, get the prisoner on the boat. We leave for France in 5 minutes." The 2 men pushed Arthur toward the edge of the pier. The lantern on the boat flickered again, and for a second, the light hit Arthur's face. He looked pale and tired, but he was alive. The man in the top hat stood at the edge of the wooden pier. He looked very happy with himself. He held the heavy leather bag close to his chest. Inside that bag were the secret documents of the London City Bank. These papers were more valuable than gold. They contained the private names of the government's foreign investors. With these papers, the Raven could control many powerful men. Put him in the center of the boat, the Raven ordered. He pointed at Arthur Gable. "Tie his hands to the metal rail. We do not want him jumping into the cold water during the trip." The 2 guards pushed Mr. Gable into the small steam boat. The boat moved down under his weight. Arthur was too weak to fight. He sat on the hard floor of the boat, his head resting against the side. The man with the pipe stood up and took a piece of thick rope. He began to tie Arthur's wrists. "What about the investigator?" the man with the pipe asked. He looked at the dark shadows of the pier. The guards at the warehouse said he escaped with the woman. "They might be here." The Raven laughed. It was a dry, mean sound. Mr. Blackwood is a clever man. But he is only one man. My guards are watching the main entrance to the docks. No one can reach Pier 7 without being seen. By the time he finds this place, we will be halfway to France. Mr. Blackwood, hiding behind the salt barrel, looked at the situation. He saw that the Raven was very confident. This was his chance. The Raven thought he was safe because his guards were at the street entrance. He did not know that Blackwood and Mrs. Gable had used the secret river tunnel. "Listen to me," Blackwood whispered to Mrs. Gable. "I am going to move toward the boat. I need to untie the rope that holds the boat to the pier. When the boat starts to move away, the Raven will be surprised. That is when you must run to the carriage and find the police." "But what about you?" Mrs. Gable asked. Her eyes were wide with fear. "They have guns and sticks. You only have a lantern." "I have something better than a gun," Blackwood said. He touched the silver-headed walking stick that the Raven had left leaning against a crate. "I have the truth." Blackwood moved like a cat. He stayed low to the ground. He crawled behind the wooden posts of the pier. The fog helped him hide. He reached the thick rope that held the boat. The knot was very tight and wet from the river. He took a small, sharp knife from his pocket. At that moment, the Raven turned around. He reached into his pocket to find a match for his own cigar. The light of the match was small, but it was enough to see a shadow moving near the boat. "Who is there?" the Raven shouted. He dropped his cigar and grabbed the heavy bag. "Guards! To the boat! Now!" Blackwood did not wait. He cut the rope with one fast movement. The boat was no longer attached to the pier. The current of the river began to pull the boat away into the dark, foggy water. "Stop!" the Raven screamed. He ran toward the edge of the pier, but he was too late. The boat was already 3 feet away from the wood. The boat continued to drift further into the dark river. The Raven stood at the very edge of the pier, his hands shaking with anger. He looked at the water and then back at the shadows where Mr. Blackwood was hiding. The guards near the carriage were confused. They did not know what to do. The plan was falling apart. Suddenly, another carriage arrived at the entrance of Pier 7. It was a very small carriage with silver lanterns. A woman stepped out onto the wet cobblestones. She was dressed entirely in black, and a thick black veil covered her face. She walked with very slow and careful steps. She did not look at the Raven or the guards. Instead, she walked toward the large salt barrels where Mr. Blackwood was standing. Mr. Blackwood stayed in the shadows. He did not move. The woman stopped only a few inches away from him. Because of the fog and the darkness, she could not see his face clearly. She saw his tall frame and his dark coat. She seemed to think he was someone else. "You are late," she whispered. Her voice was thin and very sharp. "The police are already moving toward the bank. You must take this and leave London tonight." She reached into her black silk bag and pulled out a small, wooden box. It was decorated with gold patterns of leaves and birds. She held it out to him. Mr. Blackwood did not speak. He knew that if he spoke, she would recognize his voice. He simply reached out and took the box. It was surprisingly heavy. "The Raven is a fool," the woman continued. Her voice was full of hate. "He thinks he can steal the secrets of the bank and stay safe. But the government knows everything. They are waiting for him at the river mouth. If you stay with him, you will go to prison too." She leaned closer to Mr. Blackwood. The smell of her perfume was very strong. It was the same heavy, sweet scent of the purple flowers they had found before. "Listen to my warning," she whispered. "The third key is not in the safe. It is hidden inside the clock tower at the station. Tell no one." Before Mr. Blackwood could react, the woman turned around. She walked back to her carriage as quickly as she had arrived. The horse moved, and the carriage disappeared into the grey wall of fog. Mr. Blackwood looked down at the wooden box in his hands. He felt a mix of surprise and excitement. This woman was part of the group, but she was acting against the Raven. She had given him a new clue and a secret warning. On the pier, the Raven saw the woman's carriage leave. He turned his head and saw the shape of Mr. Blackwood standing by the barrels. He realized he had been tricked. "There he is!" The Raven shouted to his guards. "He has the box. Catch him!" The two guards at the pier entrance began to run toward Mr. Blackwood. They carried heavy wooden sticks and lanterns. Blackwood looked at the river. The boat with Arthur was now a small shadow in the distance. He looked at the pier entrance. The way was blocked by the guards. He had the box, but he was trapped between the angry thieves and the deep, cold water. The two guards charged down the wooden pier, their boots thumping like drums against the wet boards. The fog swirled around them, making their lanterns look like glowing, angry eyes. Mr. Blackwood stood his ground. He didn't have a pistol, but he had something the thieves didn't expect: the silver-headed walking stick. As the first guard swung a heavy wooden club, Blackwood stepped to the side with the grace of a dancer. He felt the weight of the walking stick in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. He noticed a small, raised button near the silver handle. He pressed it. With a sharp click, a thin, strong steel blade slid out from the bottom of the stick. It wasn't a sword for killing, but a tool for defense. He didn't use the blade on the man. Instead, he used the silver handle to hook the guard's ankle. The man tripped, his lantern flying into a stack of empty fish crates. "Stay back!" Blackwood commanded the second guard. The second man stopped. He looked at his fallen friend and then at the sharp steel reflecting the moonlight. He was a dock worker, not a soldier, and he didn't want to die for the Raven's secrets. He turned and ran back toward the carriage. The Raven was now alone at the edge of the pier. His face was twisted with fury. He looked at the drifting boat, then at Blackwood, then at the wooden box the woman had delivered. "You have no idea what you are holding, investigator," the Raven hissed. "That box belongs to a power far greater than a local bank. Give it to me, or you will never leave these docks alive." "I think I'll keep it," Blackwood replied calmly, stepping closer. "Along with your actor's mask and your French coins. The game is over. The police are coming, and your French connection has already betrayed you." The Raven reached into his coat. He wasn't reaching for a cigar this time. He pulled out a small, brass derringer pistol. He pointed it directly at Blackwood's chest. "I may not have the documents, but I will have my revenge." The Raven snarled. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the air. The Raven's knees buckled, and he fell face first onto the wooden boards. Standing behind him was Mrs. Gable. She was holding a heavy iron frying pan she had snatched from a stack of supplies near the river wall. "Nobody threatens Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice shaking but her eyes bright with courage. "And nobody takes my husband." The Raven lay still. He was unconscious. Blackwood quickly took the man's silk scarf and tied his hands behind his back. "Well done, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood said with a slight, admiring smile. "I believe that was a very effective use of kitchenware." The steam launch gave a loud, metallic cough. A thick cloud of dark grey smoke puffed out from its small chimney, smelling of burnt oil and coal. The engine began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that grew louder. The boat was no longer just drifting. The man with the pipe had managed to start the motor. "They are leaving," Mrs. Gable cried, pointing at the water. "Arthur! Arthur!" The boat began to turn toward the center of the river, where the current was strongest. Once it hit the open water, no one would be able to catch it in the thick fog. Mr. Blackwood didn't hesitate. He looked at the long, thick rope he had cut earlier. One end was still tied to the wooden post on the pier. The other end was trailing in the water, but a small loop had caught onto a heavy iron cleat on the boat's stern. "Hold this, Mrs. Gable," Blackwood shouted, handing her the golden box. He ran to the edge of the pier. The gap between the wood and the boat was now nearly 6 feet. With a powerful leap, he threw himself across the dark, churning water. His hands gripped the wet railing of the boat just as it began to accelerate. For a terrifying second, his legs dangled over the freezing Thames, but he pulled himself up and over the side. A struggle in the mist. The man with the pipe let out a shout of surprise. He reached for a heavy metal wrench, but Blackwood was faster. Using the skills of a man who had seen many dark alleys, Blackwood landed a precise blow that sent the wrench clattering into the river. "The game is up," Blackwood growled, his wet coat dripping on the floorboards. "Turn this vessel back to the pier." The driver looked at Blackwood, then at the captured Raven on the docks, and finally at the dark, cold river. He realized he was alone. He put his hands up in surrender and throttled the engine down. Blackwood ignored him for a moment and knelt beside Arthur Gable. He used his small knife to quickly slice through the ropes at Arthur's wrists. "Mr. Gable, can you hear me?" Arthur blinked slowly. His face was thin, and his eyes were tired, but he managed a small, weak smile. "Blackwood, is that you?" I told them you'd find the trail. Your wife is waiting on the pier, Arthur," Blackwood said gently, helping the banker to sit up. "And she brought a frying pan. I suggest you don't keep her waiting." The secret of the golden box. With the boat safely back at the pier, the group was finally reunited. The police, led by a loud whistling sergeant, finally arrived, sparked by the commotion and the sight of the Raven tied up like a Christmas goose. As the officers led the thieves away, Blackwood sat on a crate with the Gables. He placed the golden box on his knees. The woman in the veil said this was the true power the Raven sought. Blackwood mused. He opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of blue velvet, was not a list of names or a pile of gold. It was a single, intricate wax cylinder, a recording for a phonograph, and a small, heavy signet ring with the crest of the Royal Mint. "It's not just secrets," Arthur whispered, leaning in. "That cylinder contains the recorded confession of a high-ranking official who was planning to devalue the pound. The Raven wasn't just a thief, he was a blackmailer." Blackwood closed the box. The fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the pale light of a London dawn. "Well, Mr. Gable, it seems your empty carriage was actually quite full of trouble." "And you, Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Gable said, patting her husband's hand, "are quite full of surprises." "I try my best," Blackwood replied with a wink. "But I believe I owe you a fresh cup of tea. A warm one, this time." The sun rose over London not with a golden glow, but with a pale, sickly light that struggled to pierce the remaining haze of the great fog. In Mr. Blackwood's private study, the fire in the hearth crackled with a desperate energy, as if trying to burn away the damp chill of the River Thames that still clung to his bones. Mr. Blackwood sat in his wingback chair, his eyes fixed on the golden box resting on his mahogany coffee table. Beside him, Arthur Gable sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sipping a cup of hot beef broth. The color was slowly returning to the banker's cheeks, though his hands still possessed a slight, rhythmic tremor. "The man they took away," Arthur said, his voice raspy from the cold air of the tunnels. "He called himself the Raven. But Blackwood, during my time in that theater basement, I heard things. He wasn't the one in charge. He was a performer. A very good one, but a servant nonetheless." Blackwood nodded, leaning forward to stoke the fire. "I suspected as much. The woman in the veil, the one who gave me this box, called him a fool. She spoke of the government and a third key." "Tell me, Arthur, what do you know of the clock tower at the station?" Arthur paused, the spoon hovering near his mouth. The station. You mean Charing Cross? There is a clock tower there, yes. It was built with a small room at the top for the engineers. But it has been locked for years. Why would she mention it? Because. Blackwood mused. The Raven was looking for keys. We found 2. One in your hidden safe, and one in the iron trunk. If there is a third, and it is hidden in a public clock tower, it suggests that the vault at the bank is only the first stage of a much larger mechanism. Before Arthur could respond, a heavy knocking sounded at the front door. Blackwood's manservant, a quiet man named Jenkins, entered a moment later. He carried a silver tray, but instead of tea, there was a single, damp envelope. This was pushed under the door just now, sir. Jenkins said. The messenger was gone before I could reach the handle. Blackwood opened the envelope. Inside was a single playing card. The Queen of Hearts. Across the face of the red-printed lady, someone had smeared a small smudge of that same purple pollen. She is moving again. Blackwood whispered. Who? Mrs. Gable asked, entering the room with a fresh pot of tea. The woman in the veil. Blackwood replied, showing them the card. She gave me the box to betray the Raven, but now she is playing her own game. This card is an invitation. The Queen of Hearts. She wants me to go to the heart of the city, the Royal Mint. He stood up, the exhaustion of the night seemingly forgotten. The mystery of the empty carriage had evolved. It was no longer about a missing husband. It was about a hidden hand reaching for the very pulse of the British Empire. Jenkins, fetch my spare coat. Blackwood commanded. And Arthur, stay here. Lock the doors. The theatre may be closed, but the play has moved to a much larger stage. The Royal Mint stood like a grey fortress against the backdrop of a darkening London sky. It was a place of iron, stone, and the constant, rhythmic thud of heavy machinery. Here, the wealth of the empire was forged into cold, hard coin. Mr. Blackwood stood across the street, his collar turned up against a biting wind that carried the scent of coal and hot metal. In his pocket, the Queen of Hearts felt like a heavy weight. He watched the guards at the main gate, tall men in crimson tunics who stood as still as statues. They were not the distracted guards of a private bank. These were men trained to protect the heartbeat of the nation's economy. If the woman in the veil sent me here. Blackwood whispered to himself, she didn't intend for me to walk through the front door. He circled the perimeter of the building, his eyes scanning the architecture. He looked for the subtle signs of a breach, a scuffed stone, a loose iron bar, or the telltale shimmer of purple dust. He found it near the delivery entrance where heavy wagons brought in loads of copper and silver. Tucked into a crevice of the masonry was a small, silk ribbon of deep violet. Blackwood waited for a heavy steam wagon to rattle past, its thick smoke providing a temporary screen. He slipped through the delivery gate, moving behind a stack of empty iron ingots. The internal courtyard was a maze of steam pipes and clanking gears. The noise was deafening, a perfect cover for a man of stealth. He followed the violet ribbons trail toward the old archive wing. Unlike the bustling minting floors, this part of the building was silent and coated in a fine layer of grey soot. The door to the archives was made of solid oak reinforced with steel. To his surprise, it was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of old parchment and ink. Row after row of floor-to-ceiling shelves held the records of every coin struck since the reign of King George. Blackwood moved his lantern light across the labels. Gold reserves, 1870. Silver coinage, 1882. Foreign exchange, 1885. At the very end of the hall, he saw a light. It was a soft, blue glow, flickering like a ghost between the shelves. He doused his own lantern and crept forward. There, sitting at a scholar's desk, was a figure he did not expect. It was not the woman in the veil, nor was it a common thief. It was a young man, barely 20, wearing the uniform of a mint clerk. He was frantically leafing through a massive ledger, his fingers stained dark with ink. On the desk beside him lay a third silver-headed walking stick, identical to the one the Raven had carried. The Raven was merely the distraction. Blackwood realized, his voice a low growl in the silence. The clerk jumped, the heavy ledger falling to the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He looked at Blackwood with eyes full of terror. I had to do it. They have my sister. They told me if I didn't find the ledger for the year of the empty vault, they would send her to the colonies. Who are they? Blackwood asked, stepping into the blue light. The clerk opened his mouth to answer, but a sudden, sharp thwack echoed through the room. A small, feathered dart hit the wooden desk just inches from the boy's hand. Blackwood looked up into the shadows of the high catwalks. A figure was perched there, silhouetted against a high window. It was the woman in the veil, and she was holding a small, silver blowgun. The dart quivered in the wood, its feathered tail still vibrating from the force of the impact. Mr. Blackwood didn't wait for a second shot. He lunged forward, grabbing the terrified clerk by the collar of his ink-stained tunic and pulling him beneath the heavy oak desk. A second dart hissed through the air, clattering harmlessly against the stone floor where the boy's head had been moments before. "Stay down," Blackwood hissed. The blue light from the desk lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the rows of ledgers, making the archives feel like the ribs of a great, dead beast. High above, on the narrow iron catwalk, the woman in the veil did not move. Her silhouette was sharp against the moonlit window, a dark statue of vengeance. "You are interference, Mr. Blackwood." Her voice drifted down, cold and melodic, echoing off the high ceiling. "The Raven was a common thief, but you are a man of intellect. Do not waste that intellect on a boy who has already failed his masters." "The boy is a witness," Blackwood shouted back, his eyes scanning the shelves for an exit. "And the year of the empty vault is no longer a secret. What happened in 1872, madam? Why is the Mint hiding a decade-old void in its records?" A chilling laugh was his only answer. The woman in the veil stepped back into the darkness of the upper rafters. Blackwood heard the light tread of her boots on the metal grating. She wasn't fleeing. She was repositioning. The vault was never empty, investigator. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was merely redistributed. And now, the balance must be restored. Blackwood turned to the clerk, whose face was as white as the parchment he had been protecting. "The ledger," Blackwood whispered. "Where is the entry for the 11th of November?" The boy pointed a shaking finger at the massive book lying face down on the floor. "It's not there. Pages 600 through 610. They were cut out years ago. But I found something else. A hidden pocket in the binding." Blackwood reached out and scooped up the heavy volume. He felt the spine. There was a slight bulge beneath the leather. With a pocket knife, he sliced the thread. Out slipped a small, rectangular piece of glass, a photographic slide, or perhaps a master plate for printing. It was covered in tiny, etched numbers and a series of complex gears. "The third key." Blackwood breathed. It wasn't a physical key of brass or iron. It was a visual key, a code etched in glass. Suddenly, the smell of sulfur filled the room. A small, round object bounced off the desk and rolled toward them. It wasn't a dart. It was a smoke bomb. Thick, acrid grey clouds began to pour out, blinding Blackwood and stinging his lungs. "The ledger!" The clerk screamed as a dark shape dropped from the catwalk. Blackwood felt a sharp blow to his shoulder. He swung the heavy ledger like a club, connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain followed, but then a hand snatched the glass plate from his grip. He lunged through the smoke, catching only the edge of a silk veil before it vanished. By the time the smoke cleared, the woman in the veil was gone. The clerk lay unconscious on the floor, and the glass key was missing. But as Blackwood stood up, coughing, he realized he still held the ledger. And on the inside of the back cover, The clerk had scribbled a single address in wet ink. The observatory, Greenwich, 2 a.m. The journey to Greenwich was a cold, lonely trek across the sleeping city. Mr. Blackwood had managed to secure a hansom cab, the horses' hooves rhythmically striking the cobblestones like a ticking clock. Inside the cab, Blackwood stared at the ledger. Though the glass plate was gone, the clerk's note burned in his mind. The observatory. By the time the cab reached the gates of Greenwich Park, the fog had thinned, replaced by a biting frost that turned the grass into silver needles. The hill rose before him, a dark silhouette crowned by the domes of the Royal Observatory. It was the place where time itself was measured for the world, the home of the prime meridian. "Wait here," Blackwood told the driver, handing him a handful of coins. "And keep your lantern lit. I may need to find you in a hurry." The climb up the hill was steep. Blackwood's boots crunched on the frozen path. The air here felt different than the docks or the Mint. It was thin, sharp, and silent. He reached the gates of the Flamstead house and paused. The great red time ball atop the building sat motionless, waiting for the hour of one to drop tomorrow. But for now, it looked like a giant, watchful eye. He didn't head for the main doors. The clerk's note hadn't just said the observatory. It had specified a time. 2 a.m. He walked toward the brass strip set into the stone courtyard, the meridian line. This was $0 longitude, the point where east met west. As he reached the line, he saw a figure standing near the great equatorial telescope building. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a heavy astrakhan coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was looking up at the stars through a hand-held brass sextant. "You are precisely 3 minutes early, Mr. Blackwood," the man said without turning around. Precision is a rare virtue in these chaotic times. Blackwood stopped a few paces away. "I was invited. Or rather, I followed a trail of ink and smoke." The man lowered the sextant and turned. His face was weathered, with a white beard trimmed into a sharp point. His eyes, however, were as bright as the stars above. "I am Professor Sterling. I keep the clocks here. Or I did, until someone decided that time was no longer a constant, but a commodity to be stolen." "The year of the empty vault," Blackwood said, watching the professor's reaction. Sterling's expression darkened. "Ah, so you found the ghost in the machine. In 1872, the Mint didn't just lose gold, Mr. Blackwood. They lost the standard. The master weights and the master clock were tampered with. If you control the measurement of time and weight, you control the value of every soul in the empire. The woman in the veil has a glass plate," Blackwood explained. "It looked like a master code." Sterling nodded grimly. "That glass plate is the reticle for the great telescope. When the moon reaches its zenith at exactly 2:05 tonight, the light will pass through the telescope and through that plate. It will project a map onto the floor of the octagon room. A map of the Shadow Vault, the place where the real wealth of 1872 was hidden." Blackwood looked at his watch. 1:58 a.m. "Then we have 7 minutes to stop her." "Not stop her," Sterling whispered, pointing toward the high windows of the octagon room. "Look." A faint, violet light was beginning to glow from within the telescope dome. The woman in the veil was already inside. The octagon room was a masterpiece of architectural precision, designed by Sir Christopher Wren to be the perfect window into the heavens. Its high, vaulted ceiling and large, arched windows were intended to house the finest astronomical instruments in the world. But tonight, the room served a more terrestrial and sinister purpose. Blackwood and Professor Sterling hurried through a side entrance, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs of the hallway. They reached the heavy oak doors of the great hall and pushed them open just a fraction of an inch. The room was bathed in a surreal, ethereal glow. The woman in the veil stood at the base of the massive great equatorial telescope. She had inserted the glass plate, the third key, into a specialized slot near the eyepiece. A beam of concentrated moonlight, gathered by the telescope's immense lenses, was being funneled through the etched glass. "She's calibrating it," Sterling hissed in a low whisper. "She needs the moon to align perfectly with the meridian to project the final coordinates." The light passing through the glass plate didn't just illuminate the room. It acted as a primitive slide projector. On the cold stone floor, a complex web of lines and symbols began to appear. It looked like a city map, but one that didn't match the streets of London. It was a map of the city's underground arteries, sewers, forgotten rivers, and the new tunnels of the railway, all converging on a single, unmarked point beneath the Tower of London. "The Shadow Vault." Blackwood breathed. "It's not in the Mint. It's beneath the fortress itself." The woman in the veil turned her head, sensing the disturbance in the air. Her black veil fluttered in the draught from the high windows. "Professor Sterling," she said, her voice echoing with a haunting clarity. "I expected you would bring our inquisitive friend. It is only fitting that the Keeper of Time witnesses its end." "You're playing with forces you don't understand, Elena," Sterling said, stepping into the light. His voice was no longer that of a frightened old man. It was stern and commanding. The 1872 redistribution was meant to prevent a total collapse. If you reveal the Shadow Vault, you will trigger the very chaos we sought to avoid. "Elena?" Blackwood asked, his eyes darting between the professor and the woman. "Elena Sterling," the professor clarified, his shoulders sagging. "My daughter, and the finest mathematician this country ever produced, before she decided that the truth was more important than the stability of the crown." Elena laughed, a sharp, cold sound that cut through the silence. "The truth is that the people are being sold a lie, Father. The gold isn't there. It never was. It's been replaced by promises and paper. I'm not stealing the wealth, I'm showing everyone that it's already gone." Suddenly, the red time ball atop the building made a heavy, mechanical sound. It was 2 a.m. "The alignment is complete," Elena shouted. She reached for a small lever on the telescope, intended to lock the projection onto the floor so she could trace the coordinates. But Blackwood was already moving. He didn't run for her, he ran for the telescope's base. He swung the silver-headed walking stick, the steel blade extended, and sliced through the delicate leather drive belts that rotated the instrument. The telescope lurched. The projected map on the floor blurred and shifted wildly. "No!" Elena screamed, lunging for the controls. The glass plate, under the sudden vibration, shattered into 1,000 tiny diamonds of light. The projection vanished, leaving the room in near-total darkness, save for the pale, natural moonlight. The silence that followed the shattering of the glass plate was heavier than the darkness. In the octagon room, the only sound was the jagged breathing of 3 people caught in a web of family secrets and national peril. The third key lay in ruins, 1,000 diamonds of light extinguished on the cold stone floor. Elena Sterling stood frozen, her hand still outstretched toward the telescope. The veil hid her expression, but her posture was one of absolute defeat. Professor Sterling slumped against a mahogany display case, his face buried in his hands. He had stopped his daughter, but at the cost of his own heart. "You've destroyed it," Elena whispered, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with a white-hot fury. "You've protected their lie for another generation. Do you really think the Empire is safer because its foundation is built on empty air?" Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the glass shards. He knelt and, using his handkerchief, picked up the largest remaining fragment. It was a jagged triangle of glass, barely 2 inches wide. He held it up to the pale moonlight. Though the map was gone, this tiny shard contained a single etched symbol, a crowned raven sitting atop a stylized gate. "The Traitor's Gate," Blackwood murmured. The projection showed the convergence beneath the tower. "Even without the full map, the destination is clear." Elena turned her head sharply toward him. You think you can just walk into the tower and find it. The shadow vault isn't a room, Mr. Blackwood. It's a mechanism. Without the glass plate to align the internal locks, you'll be walking into a tomb. Then you're coming with us, Blackwood said, standing up. He didn't use a tone of request. It was a cold necessity. Professor, I know this is difficult, but your daughter is the only one who can translate the mechanical language of the vault. If we don't settle this tonight, the people who are using the Raven will come for her, and they won't be as patient as I am. Sterling looked up, his eyes old and tired. He's right. Elena, the French connection, the men behind the Raven, they don't care about the truth. They only care about the leverage. If they find the vault first, they'll use it to bleed the country dry. Elena remained silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached up and unpinned her veil. It fell to the floor, revealing a face that mirrored her father's intelligence but carried a hardened edge of cynicism. Her eyes were a piercing, stormy grey. Fine, she said, her voice steady. I'll show you the vault. But not for the crown, and not for you. Father. I want to see the look on the Chancellor's face when he realizes the ghost of 1872 has finally come home to roost. Blackwood pocketed the glass shard. We have less than 3 hours before the dawn patrol at the tower. Professor, stay here and contact the Commissioner. Tell him the Raven's nest has been located. Elena, let's see if your mathematics can handle the locks of the Tudors. The handsome cab rattled over the tower bridge, the iron girders looming like the ribs of a giant above them. The Thames below was a black, oily ribbon, reflecting the scattered lights of the sleeping city. Mr. Blackwood and Elena sat in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. As they approached the massive stone walls of the Tower of London, Blackwood signalled the driver to stop near the St. Catherine's docks. They couldn't approach the main entrance. The yeoman warders were loyal to the state, and the state was exactly what Elena sought to expose. The river entrance, Blackwood said, leading the way down a set of slippery stone steps to the water's edge. The Traitor's Gate is heavily guarded from the inside, but there is an old drainage culvert nearby that hasn't been used since the cholera outbreak of '54. Elena pulled her dark cloak tight. You're well acquainted with the city's bowels, Mr. Blackwood. Is that where all investigators spend their time? Only the ones who want to see the truth of London. He replied, pointing to a low, arched opening in the stone wall, partially submerged by the rising tide. The city is a theatre, Elena. The streets are the stage, but the machinery is down here. They waded into the cold, waist-deep water. The smell of salt and old rot was overwhelming. Blackwood held his lantern high, the light reflecting off the wet, slimy walls of the culvert. They moved slowly, feeling for solid ground beneath the silt. After 20 minutes of wading, the culvert opened into a wider chamber made of ancient, rough-hewn stone. This was the foundation of the St. Thomas's Tower. Above them, they could hear the faint, rhythmic footsteps of a sentry on the wharf. Here, Elena whispered, pointing to a section of the wall where the stones were laid in a strange, hexagonal pattern. My father's notes mentioned the beehive masonry. It's a specialized pressure lock. It doesn't use a key, it uses weight. Blackwood examined the stones. Each hexagon was slightly offset. How much weight? Precisely 142 pounds. She said, looking at him. The weight of the master standard of silver that was supposedly lost in 1872. They used the stolen silver as the counterweight for the door. Blackwood looked at the stones, then at his own sturdy frame. I weigh more than that. But if we can find a way to apply the pressure gradually. He looked around and found a discarded iron strut from an old gate. Using it as a lever, he began to apply pressure to the central stone. The masonry groaned, a sound of ancient teeth grinding together. Slowly, the hexagonal section began to recede into the wall. "Listen," Blackwood whispered. From behind the wall came the sound of rushing water. But it wasn't the river. It was the sound of a hydrostatic pump. The shadow vault was waking up. The hexagonal stones didn't swing open like a door. They dissolved inward, sliding into hidden recesses with a precision that was terrifying for a structure hundreds of years old. Beyond the opening lay a spiral staircase made of dark, unpolished iron. The air that drifted up was surprisingly dry and smelled faintly of salt. "The salt cellar," Elena murmured as they began their descent. In the medieval period, the tower was used to store salt, the most valuable commodity of the time. The 1872 conspirators simply used the old storage vaults because the walls were already thick enough to block any sound. The staircase seemed to go down forever, spiraling deep beneath the bed of the Thames. Finally, they reached a heavy iron door. There was no keyhole, only a small, brass funnel protruding from the center. "What is this?" Blackwood asked, running his hand over the cold metal. "It's a liquid lock," Elena explained, reaching into her cloak and pulling out a small vial of clear blue fluid. The Raven thought the keys were physical. He was wrong. The keys are chemical. This is a specific solution of cobalt and saline. When poured into the funnel, it completes an electrical circuit between the door and the copper plates in the floor. She poured the liquid into the funnel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low hum began to vibrate through the floor. A series of glass tubes along the door frame began to glow with a faint, ghostly blue light. With a hiss of released steam, the door slid sideways. The room beyond was not a vault filled with gold bars or bags of coins. It was a vast, circular chamber filled with hundreds of wooden filing cabinets and several large, steam-powered printing presses. "This is it?" Blackwood asked, his voice echoing in the massive space. "A printing office." "Not just any office," Elena said, walking toward the nearest press. She picked up a fresh sheet of paper from a tray. It was a £10 note, but the ink was still wet, and the serial numbers were all zeros. They weren't stealing gold, Mr. Blackwood. They were creating a shadow currency. In 1872, the real gold was moved to private accounts in Zurich to pay off the debts of the Crimean War. To keep the British economy from collapsing, they started printing this. Blackwood looked at the note. It was a perfect forgery. Or rather, it wasn't a forgery at all. It was printed with the official plates, on official paper. If the world finds out that the British pound is backed by nothing but air and a secret printing press in the tower, Blackwood realized, the weight of the discovery hitting him. The entire global market will vanish overnight. And that, a voice boomed from the shadows of the printing presses, is why you will never leave this room. Out of the darkness stepped a man in a formal evening suit, his chest decorated with military medals. He held a heavy service revolver. It was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Chancellor stood tall, his shadow cast long and jagged by the blue glow of the liquid locks. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a man burdened by the weight of a crumbling world. The revolver in his hand was steady, pointed directly at Mr. Blackwood's heart. "Chancellor Vane," Blackwood said, his voice calm despite the cold barrel of the gun. "I suppose it was too much to hope that the trail ended with a common actor in a top hat. The Raven was a necessary tool, Mr. Blackwood," Vane replied, his voice a gravelly baritone. "A man of theatre to distract the public. He thought he was working for a French syndicate. In reality, he was working for the stability of this realm. If he had succeeded in stealing those documents, it would have provided a convenient excuse for the missing reserves. A theft is much easier for the markets to swallow than insolvency." Elena stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Insolvency? You've been lying to the world for 14 years. My father nearly lost his mind trying to keep your secret. He thought he was protecting the mint, but he was just protecting your career. I am protecting the Empire, girl." Vane barked. "Look around you. We are at the height of our power, but that power is a delicate clockwork. If the link between gold and the pound is severed, our ships stop, our factories close, and the sun finally sets on our flag. I didn't choose 1872. I inherited it. And I will do whatever is necessary to keep the presses turning." Blackwood glanced at the steam-powered presses. They were silent now, but the smell of ink and coal was thick. And what of Arthur Gable? Why involve a private banker? Vane sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. Gable's bank was the only one with a direct line of credit to the French banks. We needed to lose a certain amount of currency through his accounts to balance the books. He was supposed to be a silent partner, but his conscience became troublesome. He started asking questions about the serial numbers. "So you kidnapped him?" Blackwood finished. "And you used the Raven to make it look like a kidnapping for hire." "It would have worked," Vane said, clicking the hammer of the revolver back. "If you hadn't been so remarkably persistent. You found the purple flowers, the red mud, the hidden tunnels. You're a very good investigator. Blackwood, it's a pity you don't work for me." "I work for the truth," Blackwood said, his hand slowly sliding toward the silver-headed walking stick in his coat. "The truth is a luxury we can no longer afford." Vane said. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, a loud hiss of steam erupted from the main boiler behind him. The pressure gauge, which Elena had subtly adjusted while Vane was speaking, had reached its limit. A pipe burst, filling the air with a blinding white cloud. The roar of the escaping steam drowned out the sound of the gunshot. The bullet whizzed past Blackwood's ear, embedding itself in a wooden cabinet of forged notes. Blackwood didn't hesitate. He lunged through the white mist, his silver-headed walking stick leading the way. He didn't strike the Chancellor. Instead, he swung the heavy handle against the main pressure lever of the printing presses. The machines groaned into life. The sudden movement of the massive iron rollers created a vacuum, pulling the clouds of steam into the vents and clearing the air. Chancellor Vane was staggering back, coughing and wiping his eyes. He raised his gun again, but Elena was already there. She hadn't used a weapon. She had used a heavy glass inkpot, shattering it against the floor at his feet. The slick black ink spread instantly, and Vane lost his footing, sliding across the stone floor. Blackwood was on him in a second, pinning the man's arm to the ground and twisting the revolver from his grip. "It's over, Vane," Blackwood growled. "The ghost of 1872 is out of the bottle." "You think so?" Vane gasped, a strange, bloody smile on his face. "Look at the presses. Blackwood. Look at the paper." Blackwood looked. The machines were churning at high speed now, but they weren't printing £10 notes anymore. Elena's tampering had caused the plates to shift. The presses were now churning out hundreds of sheets of paper with a single message printed in bold, black letters. "The gold is gone. The tower is empty. The debt is paid. I set the secondary plates," Elena said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. "These presses are linked to the pneumatic tube system that runs from the tower to the major newspapers in Fleet Street. By the time the sun is up, 5,000 of these will be sitting on the desks of every editor in London." Vane's face went pale. "You've destroyed us. You've destroyed everything." "No," Blackwood said, looking at the mountain of paper growing on the floor. "We've just made the truth a commodity, and the market is about to open." Suddenly, the heavy iron door they had entered through began to shake. The sound of shouting and the rhythmic clatter of boots echoed down the spiral stairs. The yeoman warders had heard the steam explosion. "We need to go," Blackwood said, grabbing Elena's hand. "Vane, You can stay and explain your shadow currency to the Queen's Guard. I think they'll find your ledgers very interesting." They ran for the back of the chamber, where the map had shown a second exit leading to the river. Behind them, the presses continued to clatter, a mechanical heartbeat announcing the end of an era. The cold air of the Thames had never felt so sweet. Mr. Blackwood and Elena emerged from a small, hidden hatch beneath the wharf, dripping wet and covered in the black ink of the shadow vault. The tower loomed behind them, its grey stones beginning to catch the first hints of pre-dawn light. "We have 30 minutes," Elena said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "The pneumatic tubes are fast, but the morning editions are already being laid out. If we don't get to Fleet Street to explain the context, Vane's men will intercept those papers and call them a hoax." Blackwood scanned the road. A single hansom cab was parked near the Mint, the driver dozing on his perch. Blackwood ran to it, tossing a handful of gold sovereigns, real ones, this time, into the man's lap. "Fleet Street. As fast as the horse can fly." The carriage lurched forward. As they raced through the empty streets, Blackwood looked at the glass shard in his pocket. He realized that the mystery of the empty carriage had never been about one man's disappearance. It was about the disappearance of a nation's soul, hidden away in a cellar to keep a dream alive. "Why did you do it, Elena?" he asked. "You knew it would cause chaos. People will lose their savings. The banks will close. Because a lie that large is a prison," she replied, staring out the window at the passing gaslights. "My father lived in that prison. Arthur Gable was kidnapped for it. How many more people have to suffer to keep the Chancellor's stability? I'd rather we face the winter as we are, than live in a summer that doesn't exist." They reached Fleet Street just as the first light of dawn hit the domes of St. Paul's. The street was a hive of activity. Men in ink-stained aprons were hauling crates of paper, and the smell of fresh news was thick in the air. They burst into the offices of the Daily Gazette. The editor, a man named Mr. Higgins with a cigar clamped between his teeth, was staring at a pile of papers that had just arrived via the pneumatic tube. "Blackwood," Higgins barked. "What is the meaning of this? These papers say the gold is gone. It sounds like a madman's prank." "It's no prank, Higgins," Blackwood said, slamming the ledger from the Mint onto the desk. "It's a 14-year-old crime, and the man behind it is currently sitting in a pool of ink beneath the Tower of London." Higgins looked from the ledger to the forged notes Elena had brought with her. His eyes widened. "If I print this, it'll be the biggest story in the history of the world. Or the end of it." "Print it," Blackwood said. "The sun is up. The fog is gone. Let the people see what they're really holding in their pockets." The headlines of the Daily Gazette hit the streets like a thunderbolt. "The Great Deception. The Shadow Vault Revealed." By noon, the city was in a state of controlled panic. Lines formed outside the banks, but there was no gold to give. The Chancellor had been arrested, but as Blackwood had suspected, he was only one head of the Hydra. The French connection, the mysterious syndicate that had funded the Raven, had not been caught. And they had something far more dangerous than forged notes. They had the master plates for the new international currency. "They're moving them tonight," Elena said, her eyes red from lack of sleep. They were back in Blackwood's study. Arthur Gable was there too, looking much stronger. "My father heard from his contacts at the Admiralty. A private train has been commissioned for a diplomatic shipment to Dover. It leaves at midnight from Victoria Station. If those plates reach France," Arthur said, "the syndicate can print their own British currency from anywhere in Europe. The economic collapse won't just be local, it will be permanent." Blackwood stood up, checking his pocket watch. 10 p.m. Then we have 2 hours to stop a train. "Arthur, you know the bank security codes. If we can get into the signal box at the station, We can stop that train before it leaves the platform." "I'm coming too," Elena said. "I know how they've modified the plates. I'm the only one who can disable them without destroying the evidence we need to convict the rest of the syndicate." They reached Victoria Station under a shroud of heavy rain. The station was a cathedral of iron and glass, the steam from the locomotives creating a private fog. The diplomatic special was sitting on platform 9. It was a short train, just an engine, a coal tender, and 2 heavily armored carriages. Blackwood saw the men guarding the platform. They weren't yeoman warders or bank guards. They were mercenaries, wearing the same dark coats as the men from the docks. "We can't go through the guards," Blackwood whispered. "The roof. We'll drop onto the coal tender from the maintenance catwalks." As they climbed the iron ladders to the station's high rafters, the whistle of the engine blew. The wheels began to grind against the tracks. The train was moving. "Jump!" Blackwood shouted. They leapt from the catwalk, landing hard on the pile of coal. The train began to pick up speed, leaving the lights of the station behind and heading into the dark, rainy night of the English countryside. The wind whipped through Mr. Blackwood's hair as the train roared through the darkness. The smell of burning coal and wet iron was dizzying. They were moving at 40 miles per hour, the carriage swaying violently as the engine gathered strength. "We need to get to the first armored car," Blackwood shouted over the roar of the wind. He led the way, crawling over the coal tender toward the narrow door of the first carriage. He reached for the handle, but it was locked from the inside. He looked through the small, reinforced window. Inside, 4 men were sat around a heavy iron crate. One of them was the man with the short hair from the theater, the actor who had played the Raven's shadow. "They've seen us," Elena cried. The man inside pulled a lever. Suddenly, the roof of the carriage began to slide back. It wasn't a passenger car. It was a mobile fortress. 2 men emerged from the roof, holding short-barreled carbines. "Get down!" Blackwood tackled Elena and Arthur onto the coal, just as a hail of bullets whistled over their heads. The train was approaching the Medway Viaduct, a massive iron bridge that spanned a deep river valley. The heights were terrifying. If they didn't take the carriage now, the mercenaries would have a clear shot at them on the open bridge. Blackwood pulled the silver-headed walking stick from his belt. He didn't use the blade. He reached into the hidden compartment in the handle and pulled out a small, high-tensile wire, a garrote he usually used for picking locks, but today it would serve as a grapple. He threw the wire, hooking it onto the edge of the sliding roof. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled himself up, swinging his legs and kicking the first gunman squarely in the chest. The man tumbled back into the coal tender, his gun clattering onto the tracks. Blackwood climbed onto the roof of the armored car, his boots slipping on the wet metal. He reached down and offered a hand to Elena. "The plates are inside," she shouted, pointing toward the heavy crate. But as she reached the roof, the train hit the center of the viaduct. A second engine, hidden in a siding on the bridge, suddenly lurched forward, coupling itself to the back of their train. It was a trap. The syndicate wasn't just taking the plates, they were stealing the entire train. From the second engine, a familiar figure emerged. It was the woman in the veil, or rather, a woman dressed like her. But as she stepped into the light of the engine's firebox, Blackwood saw her face. It was the Chancellor's wife, Lady Vane. "My husband was a fool for the crown," she shouted over the wind. "But I have always been a creature of the market, and the market says these plates are worth more than London itself." The 2 engines roared in a mechanical tug-of-war across the Medway Viaduct. The rain turned to sleet, making the roof of the armored carriage a treacherous sheet of ice. Mr. Blackwood stood balanced on the edge, the silver-headed stick in one hand and the iron railing in the other. "Lady Vane," Blackwood shouted, "your husband is in a cell. Do you really want to join him? The plates are useless without the final cipher." Lady Vane laughed, a shrill sound that pierced through the storm. She held up a small, leather-bound book. The cipher was in his study all along, hidden in a copy of Paradise Lost. My husband thought he was the only one who could read the Shadow Vault's code, but he forgot who taught him his French. Elena, crouched near the edge of the roof, looked at Blackwood. She's lying. The cipher isn't a book. It's a frequency. The plates are made of a specific alloy that only takes ink when vibrated at a certain pitch. That's why the presses in the tower were so loud. Blackwood realized the truth. The syndicate didn't need the Chancellor. They needed the mechanism. Elena, can you disrupt the vibration? Blackwood asked. I need to get to the internal gears of the carriage. She replied. Blackwood looked at Lady Vane, who was signaling her men to move forward. Go. I'll keep them busy. As Elena and Arthur dropped into the hatch of the armored car, Blackwood turned to face the mercenaries. He didn't have a gun, but he had the environment. He waited until the train hit a sharp curve on the bridge. As the carriage tilted, he kicked the heavy iron lever that controlled the sliding roof. The massive metal lid slammed shut, catching one of the gunman's legs. As the man screamed, Blackwood leapt onto the second engine, facing Lady Vane. You're a long way from the ballroom, Lady Vane, Blackwood said, stepping toward her. She pulled a small, elegant pistol from her muff. And you're a long way from your quiet little office, Mr. Blackwood. But I suppose we both enjoy a bit of drama. She fired, but the lurch of the engine caused the shot to go wide, shattering the glass of the engine's pressure gauge. Scalding water sprayed everywhere. Inside the armored car, a strange, high-pitched ringing sound began to echo. It was Elena. She had found the vibration plates and was using her metal hairpins to scratch the surface, creating a dissonant frequency. The plates. Lady Vane screamed, seeing the blue sparks flying from the carriage. Stop her. The armored car began to glow with a strange, static electricity. The alloy was reacting to the disruption. With a sound like 1,000 bells shattering, the master plates inside the crate cracked. The third key was finally, truly broken. The explosion of static energy threw Lady Vane back against the coal tender, her pistol skittering away into the darkness. The second engine, no longer receiving power from the main boiler, began to slow down, its wheels screeching against the iron tracks of the viaduct. Mr. Blackwood stood over her, his coat scorched and his face covered in soot. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took the leather-bound book, the fake cipher, from her hand. It's over, he said quietly. The train came to a shuddering halt at the very end of the bridge. In the distance, the lights of several other locomotives appeared. These weren't syndicate trains. They carried the royal blue flags of the Queen's personal guard. A tall man in a pristine uniform stepped onto the tracks, flanked by soldiers with fixed bayonets. He was the Duke of Marlborough, the Queen's own messenger. Mr. Blackwood, I presume, the Duke said, his voice cold and formal. Her Majesty has been briefed on the situation. It seems you have uncovered a wound that has been festering for far too long. Blackwood stepped off the engine, helping Elena and Arthur down. Elena was holding the fragments of the master plates. They were useless now, nothing more than scrap metal. The Shadow Vault is closed, Your Grace, Blackwood said, handing over the leather book. And the currency of the realm is, well, it's honest now, even if that honesty is painful. The Duke looked at the broken plates and the arrested Lady Vane. Honesty is a bitter medicine. Mr. Blackwood, there will be a great deal of work to do. The Chancellor's shadow treasury must be dismantled, and a new gold standard must be found. It may take years to rebuild what was lost in 1872. We've already started, Arthur Gable said, stepping forward. My bank, and several others who are not part of this conspiracy, are already pooling our private reserves to back a new, public issue of currency. We won't let the empire fall because of a few men's greed." The Duke nodded. "A noble sentiment, Mr. Gable. Her Majesty will be pleased to hear it." He turned back to Blackwood. "And as for you, sir, you have done a great service to the Crown. Though, officially, this entire affair, the Raven, the Shadow Vault, the train, will never have happened. Can I trust your silence?" Blackwood looked at Elena, then at the rising sun. "The truth is already in the newspapers. Your Grace, you can't hide the sun with a veil forever." The Duke smiled thinly. "Perhaps not. But we can certainly manage the shadow it casts." 3 days later, London was a city transformed. The initial panic had settled into a grim determination. The new Gold Standard Act had been rushed through Parliament, and while the economy was shaky, the sense of a hidden rot had been replaced by a difficult transparency. Mr. Blackwood, however, was not at the celebrations. He was in the basement of Professor Sterling's house in Greenwich. The professor and Elena had converted the old cellar into a laboratory, filled with the remnants of the technology they had salvaged from the Shadow Vault. "There's one thing that still bothers me, Elena," Blackwood said, watching her examine a copper plate under a microscope. "Only one?" she asked with a small smile. "The purple flowers," Blackwood said, pulling a dried petal from his pocket. "The Cattleya triani. They weren't just a calling card. They were everywhere the syndicate went. The carriage, the bank, the theatre, the woman's veil." Elena sighed and stepped away from the microscope. "It wasn't a calling card, Mr. Blackwood. It was a chemical filter. The ink they used for the shadow currency had a high concentration of mercury and lead. It's highly toxic to breathe in closed spaces like the vault or the armored train." She pointed to the petal. "The pollen of that specific orchid has a natural property that neutralizes the metallic vapors. The Raven and his men weren't being theatrical. They were wearing the flowers and the scented veils to keep from being poisoned by their own money." Blackwood looked at the petal with a new perspective. So the scent of the truth was actually a safety precaution. "Exactly," Elena said. "But look at this." She showed him a ledger they had found in Lady Vane's belongings. It wasn't a list of names. It was a map of a different set of tunnels. These didn't lead to the Tower or the Mint. They led to the London docks, specifically to a warehouse owned by a company called the Eastern Star. Lady Vane was just the London agent. Elena whispered, "The syndicate's real power is overseas. They weren't just printing British pounds. They were printing the currency of every major colony. India, Australia, Canada. They were trying to replace the global economy with their own shadow standard." Blackwood stood up, his coat already in his hand. "The Raven is caught, the Chancellor is in prison, and the plates are broken. But the printing presses in the colonies are still turning. What are you going to do?" she asked. "The empty carriage started this in London," Blackwood said, his eyes sharp. "I think it's time I saw where it's going in the rest of the world." The warehouse at the Eastern Star docks was a cathedral of wood and salt. Mr. Blackwood moved through the stacks of crates, his silver-headed stick held low. He wasn't alone. Jenkins, his faithful manservant, was with him, carrying a heavy iron crowbar. "This is the one, sir," Jenkins whispered, pointing to a crate-marked machinery. "Bombay Transit." Blackwood used his stick to pry open the lid. Inside, nestled in straw, was a silver press, a portable, hand-cranked version of the massive machines from the tower. It was small enough to fit in a trunk, but powerful enough to ruin a small nation's economy. "They're shipping them out tonight," Blackwood realized. "Dozens of them. If even one of these reaches its destination, the shadow currency will live on." Suddenly, the doors of the warehouse swung open. A group of men entered, led by a man Blackwood recognized from the French coins he had found. It was the French connection himself, a man known only as Le Chiffre. "Mr. Blackwood," Le Chiffre said, his accent smooth and dangerous. "I heard you were a man who appreciated fine machinery. It's a pity you arrived just as we were closing the shop." The men surrounded them, their hands on their pistols. But Blackwood didn't look afraid. He looked at the silver press. "You're too late, Le Chiffre," Blackwood said. "I didn't come here to stop the shipment. I came here to change the destination." He held up a small, brass device, a telegraph key he had wired into the warehouse's own communication line. "I've just sent a message to the Royal Navy. Every ship in this harbor is being boarded as we speak, and your Bombay transit is being redirected to the bottom of the English Channel." Le Chiffre's face twisted in rage. "You would destroy such beauty." "I'd destroy 1,000 of them to keep the world honest," Blackwood replied. As the sounds of whistles and running boots echoed outside, Le Chiffre realized he had lost. He turned to flee, but Jenkins was faster, the iron crowbar coming down with a satisfying thud on the man's shoulder. The final shipment of the Shadow Vault was secured. The machines were seized, and the names of the international conspirators were found in the silver press's logs. The mystery of the empty carriage had reached its final act, but there was one last piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The Raven, the actor who had started it all, was still in his cell at Newgate Prison, and he had asked to see Mr. Blackwood. Blackwood walked through the cold, damp halls of the prison. The smell of despair was thick, but in the Raven's cell, there was a strange sense of peace. The man sat on his cot, reading a book of Shakespeare's plays. "You look well, for a dead man," Blackwood said, leaning against the bars. The Raven looked up, a sad smile on his face. An actor always enjoys a good final act. "Mr. Blackwood, but I didn't ask you here to talk about my performance. I asked you here to tell you about the empty carriage." "I thought we had solved that," Blackwood said. "It was a distraction." "Was it?" The Raven stood up and walked to the bars. "Think back, investigator. Why was the carriage empty before I arrived at the bank? Why was Arthur Gable already gone when the carriage stopped?" Blackwood frowned. He went back through his notes. The driver, John, had said Arthur vanished during the trip, but the timing had always been tight. Arthur didn't vanish. The Raven whispered. "He was never in the carriage to begin with. The man you saw getting into the carriage at the house, that was me. I played Arthur Gable to trick the driver, to trick the wife, and to trick you." Blackwood's blood ran cold. Then where was the Real Arthur Gable? He was already at the bank. The Raven said. He had gone there hours before, in secret, to try and stop the Shadow Vault from opening. But he was caught by the Chancellor's men. My disappearance was a cover to explain why he was missing when he was already a prisoner. "And the purple flower in the carriage?" Blackwood asked. "A gift from Lady Vane." The Raven laughed. "To make sure you followed the scent exactly where she wanted you to go. You didn't find the truth, Blackwood. You were led to it, so that you would destroy the Chancellor and clear the way for Lady Vane and the Syndicate." Blackwood realized the depth of the manipulation. He hadn't been the hero of the story. He had been the ultimate tool. The Raven's words echoed in Mr. Blackwood's mind as he raced back to Victoria Station. If the Syndicate had used him to clear out the Chancellor, then the final prize, the third key's backup, was still in play. And the woman in the veil had told him where it was. The clock tower at the station. He met Elena and Arthur at the base of the tower. The rain was still falling, a relentless grey curtain. The Raven was right. Blackwood said, his voice grim. "We were part of the play. Lady Vane wanted her husband out of the way so she could take full control. and the backup cipher is at the top of this tower. Then we have to get there first," Elena said, her face set in determination. They began the long climb up the narrow, winding stairs of the clock tower. The sound of the massive gears ticking was like a heartbeat. As they reached the top level, they found the door to the engineer's room had been blown open. Inside, Lady Vane's remaining mercenaries were holding the station master at gunpoint. They were frantically searching the clock's mechanism. "The cipher isn't a book," one of them shouted. "It's part of the clock." Blackwood burst in, the silver-headed stick extended. "It's over. The police are on their way." A firefight erupted in the narrow space. Blackwood used the massive brass gears of the clock as cover, the bullets ricocheting off the iron. Elena dived for the station master, pulling him to safety. "The bell!" Arthur shouted. "Look at the bell." Blackwood looked up. Inside the massive bronze bell of the clock, a series of silver etchings had been made. When the bell rang, the vibrations would translate into the final frequency needed for the Shadow Vault's presses. "They're going to ring the bell," Elena cried. One of the mercenaries reached for the manual override. Blackwood threw his walking stick, the silver head striking the man's hand just as the clock hit the hour. The massive hammer swung, but Blackwood jammed the steel blade of his stick into the gears. The clock groaned, the metal grinding and sparking. The bell didn't ring. The frequency was silenced. The gears of the Victoria Station clock tower screamed as the steel blade of Mr. Blackwood's walking stick held back the weight of time. The mercenaries, seeing their plan literally jammed, panicked. In the confusion, the leader of the group, a woman in a tattered black veil, stepped out from behind the clock's pendulum. "Lady Vane," Blackwood gasped, struggling to keep the pressure on the gear. The woman laughed, but she didn't sound like the Chancellor's wife. She reached up and tore the veil away. It wasn't Lady Vane. It was the bank manager's secretary, a woman they had seen briefly in Chapter 5. "I am the Raven's sister," she said, her eyes burning with a cold light. "And I am the true architect of the Shadow Standard. The Chancellor, the lady, my brother, they were all just pieces on my board." She held a small, glass vial of the cobalt liquid, the chemical key. "If I can't have the frequency, I'll have the fire." She threw the vial into the clock's sparking gears. The liquid, highly flammable, ignited instantly. The top of the tower was suddenly engulfed in a blue, chemical flame. "Get out!" Blackwood shouted to Elena and Arthur. He lunged for the woman, but she was gone, disappearing into the smoke of the burning tower. Blackwood grabbed the station master and pushed him toward the stairs. As the tower burned, the silver etchings inside the bell began to melt, the secrets of the Shadow Vault finally being consumed by the flames. The fire at Victoria Station was visible for miles. It marked the final end of the mystery that had begun with an empty carriage. In the days that followed, the full truth was finally laid bare. The great disclosure was published in every newspaper in the Empire. The Shadow Vault, the forged notes, the toxic ink, and the secret printing presses were all revealed. The public was shocked, but the transparency brought a strange kind of calm. The mystery was gone, and in its place was the hard work of rebuilding. Arthur Gable returned to his bank, his reputation as a man of conscience restored. Elena and Professor Sterling were given a government grant to oversee the creation of a new, truly secure gold standard. Mr. Blackwood sat in his study, the charred remains of his silver-headed walking stick resting on the mantel. He looked at the last purple flower, now dry and brittle. "It's over, Jenkins," he said as his manservant brought in a fresh tray of tea. "Is it ever truly over, sir?" Jenkins asked. Blackwood looked at the morning paper. There was a small notice in the corner about a woman in a black veil seen boarding a ship for the Americas. "Perhaps not," Blackwood said. "But for today, the carriage is full." And the truth is out. The London streets were finally quiet. The economic crisis had passed, and the new currency, backed by genuine gold and international cooperation, was being distributed. But for Mr. Blackwood, there was one final task. He walked to the cemetery where the Raven's sister had supposedly been buried years ago. He found the grave empty. In its place was a single, fresh orchid. "I knew you wouldn't stay in the shadows," a voice said behind him. Blackwood turned. It was Elena. She was wearing a new coat, and her eyes were bright. "The government wants to hire you, Blackwood," she said. "A new department. For the things that don't fit in the ledgers." Blackwood looked at the empty grave. "I think I've had enough of ledgers for a while. But the world is still full of empty carriages," she said with a smile. Blackwood looked at her, then at the city skyline. "Then I suppose I'll need a new walking stick." It was a cold Tuesday evening in 1886, exactly 1 year since the mystery began. A black carriage pulled up to the curb outside Mr. Blackwood's office. The driver, a man with a familiar flat cap, hopped down and opened the door. The carriage was empty. Mr. Blackwood stepped out of his office, his new silver-headed stick clicking against the pavement. He looked at the carriage, then at the driver. "Where to this time, John?" Blackwood asked. The driver handed him a small, sealed envelope. Inside was a single, purple petal and a note in elegant handwriting. "The clock in Paris is 3 minutes slow. Shall we fix it?" Blackwood smiled and stepped into the carriage. As the door closed, he looked at Elena, who was already sitting in the shadows of the seat. "The carriage isn't empty after all," she said. "No," Blackwood replied as the horses started to move. "It never was."